Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never expected anything strange to happen at my office. It's a modern building with clean white walls, bright overhead lights, and polished floors. It has motion detectors and a security system that's fairly new. Nothing about the place looks eerie. Yet for several months I've experienced moments that make me question my own senses. I'm a financial analyst. I work on spreadsheets, budgets, and forecasts. My days usually stretch into the night because I prefer getting everything in order before heading home. I've always liked the quiet that settles over the office after everyone leaves. I used to feel calm during those hours. Now I feel uneasy. I first heard footsteps when I was staying late to finish projections for a client. It was close to 2 in the morning. I was focused on my screen, checking numbers for errors. The only noise was the hum of the air conditioning system and the light tap of my fingers on the keyboard. Then I heard it. A slow, steady step in the corridor outside my office. At first I thought it was the cleaning staff. The building hires a small crew that usually comes in around midnight or so. I assumed I'd lost track of time, and maybe they were still around. I stopped typing and waited. My ears picked up another soft step, and then another. They weren't rushed. They sounded measured and deliberate. I got up, walked to the office door, and opened it. The corridor light was off. Usually, when the cleaning staff is working, they leave the corridor lights on. I called out once. There was no answer. I switched on the corridor light and looked left, then right. It was empty. All the other office doors were locked. I shrugged and went back inside. I tried to shake off the feeling that I wasn't alone. I heard those footsteps again the next night. This time I was sure it had to be a coworker. The steps sounded heavier. They made a clear echo on the shiny floor. I got up right away, not wanting to miss whoever it was. The door was locked, so I had to unlock it before stepping out. The corridor light was off again. I flipped the switch. No one was there. I walked around, checking if any other doors were open. Every door was shut and locked. I walked the entire length of the corridor until I reached the elevators. They were still. I pressed the button just to see if maybe someone was inside. Nothing. I felt a small ache in my chest because I was a bit nervous, but I also felt a spark of curiosity. I couldn't understand how footsteps that clear could just vanish. I told myself to ignore it. Maybe I was hearing the building settle. Sometimes big office buildings make noises when the HVAC system kicks on, but I'd never heard anything that sounded so much like someone walking. My shoulders were tense as I went back to my desk. I tried to bury myself in more spreadsheets. Time passed and I pushed it out of my mind. A week later, it happened again. Same time, around 2 in the morning, same situation. I was halfway through adjusting some budget lines for a project. I heard those deliberate steps. I froze, my heart pounding. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I thought about ignoring it, but the sound kept going. It felt like it was coming closer. Without turning my head, I listened. I could count each footstep. It paused near my door. I spun around in my chair, staring at the closed door. The footsteps stopped. I stood up slowly, forcing myself to keep breathing. I was alone in my office with just a desk lamp and the glow of the computer monitor. I approached the door. My pulse felt loud in my ears. I opened it and stuck my head out into the corridor. Nothing. No movement, no sound, no shadows. The lights were off as usual. I hit the switch. Empty hallway, locked doors, silence. My teeth clenched. I looked around, half expecting to see a coworker playing a prank, but no one was there. The cleaning crew had left an hour earlier. I'd heard them say goodnight before they headed out. I locked the door and sat back down at my desk. My chair squeaked and I realized my palms were sweaty. I rubbed them on my pants and exhaled. This continued for weeks. Almost every night, the same time, the same corridor, the same footsteps. Sometimes they would stop right outside my office. Other times they seemed to pass by as if heading toward the exit. Each time I got up to look, I found nothing. I started to question myself. I checked with security downstairs. They said they hadn't seen anyone moving around up there at that hour. The cameras in the lobby showed no one entering or leaving except the cleaning crew at their usual time. The cleaning crew also said they never returned after they finished their rounds. I believed them. They seemed sincere, and they're usually gone by 1 in the morning. One particular night stands out. I was eating a late dinner at my desk, just a sandwich and a bag of chips. I felt drained from a tough day. I had multiple reports due. I remember glancing at the clock on my computer, which read 1:58 a.m. My eyes were heavy. I leaned back in my chair, took a sip of water, and closed my eyes for a moment. That's when I heard a soft click, like someone touching my office doorknob. I opened my eyes. My mouth felt dry. I pushed my chair back and waited, staring at the door. The handle didn't move again, but I knew I heard something. Then came the footsteps, one by one, heading away from my door. I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I stood up, not sure if I should open the door. My chest felt tight. I walked toward the door slowly, keeping my eyes on the knob as if it might jiggle on its own. When I finally placed my hand on it, it felt cold. I paused, then turned the knob and pulled the door open. The corridor was dark again. I was sure I'd left that light on earlier. I flicked the switch. The hallway was still. I listened, trying to pick up any clue. There was only the low sound of the air conditioning. I took a few steps out, scanning the area. Everything was locked exactly as before. I went back inside, closed the door, and sat down. My hands were trembling a bit. I tried to go back to work, but my concentration was shot. Instead, I fiddled with my phone, checked some emails, and waited for my nerves to settle. That's when I felt a weird pressure on my shoulders. It felt like someone resting their hands on me from behind. I jerked forward and nearly dropped my phone. My heart was pounding hard. I shot up from my chair, turned around, and saw nothing. The office was empty except for me and my computer. I stared at my chair, half expecting to see a dent or a mark, but there was nothing unusual. I packed up my stuff in a hurry that night. I didn't check the corridor again, I just needed to get out. I remember feeling this tension in my neck and a kind of tingling down my arms. I felt a little lightheaded. My mind raced with the thought that something or someone had been standing behind me, touching me. But the logical side of me kept saying, "It's just stress. You're overworked. You're imagining it." I tried to believe that. I really did. The next morning, when I turned on my computer, I noticed a few files had new names. They were small changes, but I recognized them because I'm organized with my folders. For example, one file that used to be labeled Q2 Budget. KLSX had become Q2 Budget Revised, XLSX. Another file had a random underscore in the name. I thought maybe I had renamed them in a rush, but I didn't remember doing that. I asked a few coworkers if they had accessed my computer or used my login, but they all shook their heads. Our company has strict rules about logging in under someone else's credentials. No one admitted to being there late. I checked the system logs. The last login was indeed mine. I couldn't figure it out. It bothered me, so I kept asking around, but I got nowhere. After that incident, I started double-checking the office doors each night. I'd make a quick round before settling in, just to confirm everything was locked. I started leaving more lights on in the corridor, thinking that if something was making those noises, I wanted to see it coming. But even with the lights on, I heard the footsteps. Sometimes they sounded faint, sometimes louder. Whenever I rushed out to see if anyone was there, I found nothing. At times, it felt like the steps stopped right where I was standing, but there was no one. I also noticed a pattern. It almost always happened around 2 in the morning. Occasionally, it happened closer to 2:30, but it was never much earlier or later. It was so consistent that I stopped checking the clock when I heard it. I just knew it had to be close to that time. I tried bringing this up with a few coworkers in a casual way, without sounding too paranoid. Most of them dismissed it, saying they never heard anything strange when they stayed late. A couple of them seemed uncomfortable talking about it, as if they didn't want to think about anything spooky in the office. Our boss brushed it off, saying it might be the HVAC system or the building's security patrol doing rounds, but I asked the security guard about it. He told me his rounds were done on the lower floors and he rarely came up to our floor after midnight. That didn't put my mind at ease. Despite all this, I continued working late. I had deadlines, I had responsibilities, and I wasn't going to let some unexplained noises scare me away. But the truth is, my nerves were on edge. I could feel my heart rate spike every time the clock neared 2. I'd catch myself pausing my work to listen, dreading the next set of footsteps. One night I decided to film my office and the corridor using my phone. I set up my phone on a small tripod near the door, letting it record video while I continued working. I wanted to catch something, anything, that might explain what was happening. Sure enough, right on schedule, I heard footsteps. They paused near my door. I stayed very still, trying not to breathe too loudly. Once the sound faded, I got up, stopped the recording, and played it back. I heard nothing on the audio except the light hum of the air conditioning. The hallway footage showed only darkness. No movement, no shadows, no sign of a person. I couldn't believe it. The camera didn't pick up the footsteps I'd heard with my own ears. I felt a chill because it confirmed that no one was actually walking there, at least not physically. That thought unsettled me. I had a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, maybe an auditory hallucination from working too late. But I knew I wasn't the type to imagine things so vividly. I'm a numbers guy. I deal in facts, data, and evidence. Over time, I noticed more odd changes in my files. Sometimes rows were hidden or a worksheet tab was renamed. It was never anything significant, just small changes that made me double-check my sanity. I kept asking around, but nobody owned up to it. It all seemed to happen after that weird night when I felt pressure on my shoulders. I also tried a few other tactics. I left a sticky note on my desk with the words, "Who's there?" written on it, just to see if someone would reply as a prank. The next morning, the note was still there. No response. I tried leaving the corridor light on all night. I could still hear the footsteps. I went as far as disconnecting my computer from the network before I left, just to see if any remote login was happening. But the next day, I still found small changes on my files. It made no sense. Over these months, I've grown used to the idea that something unexplained is happening. My coworkers don't ask me much about it anymore. They probably think I'm just stressed or exhausted, but I know what I hear. I know what I feel. Some nights, the footsteps are so clear that I'm sure a person is standing right behind the door. But every time I open it, I see the dark corridor, silent and still. I don't know what to believe. Part of me thinks it has to be a mechanical issue or some glitch in the system that causes weird noises, but that doesn't explain the files being renamed. Another part of me wonders if I've stumbled onto something I can't fully understand. I don't have proof, and I don't have a rational explanation. I just have these experiences that repeat over and over. I still work there. I still stay late. My tasks haven't changed, and deadlines don't wait. But every time the clock approaches 2, I feel a tightness in my chest. My shoulders tense up. My hands get a little sweaty. I try to keep working, but I brace myself. When I hear those footsteps, I grip the arm of my chair, trying to decide if I should look or ignore it. Most nights I look, and most nights I find nothing. Before I leave, I do a final check. I look at my file names, save my work, and lock my computer. I walk through the corridor, making sure every door is secure. Then I head to the elevator, feeling that weight of uncertainty in my gut. I can't shake the sense that something is watching me. Sometimes I glance back over my shoulder, but the hallway is always empty. I wish I could say I found a solution or that it all stopped one day, but it hasn't. It's still happening. Maybe one day I'll figure it out. For now, I just live with it. I do my job and try not to think too hard about the footsteps at 2 in the morning, the pressure on my shoulders, or the files that keep getting renamed. It's become part of my routine, an unsettling routine, but still part of my life. I lock my door, turn off the lights, and leave with a racing heart. And every time I return, I wonder what I'll find next. I never expected to feel unsafe in a place that looked so calm during the day. I signed a lease on a small beach house, far from the usual tourist spots, because I needed solitude for my environmental research project. At first, I thought I'd gotten lucky with the weather and the setting, but every night turned into a struggle to stay calm. I tried to explain it to friends on the phone, but they didn't get it. I want to describe it exactly as it happened, without dressing it up. I want to lay out what I experienced and how it felt. It wasn't some dramatic Hollywood horror. It was just me, alone, hearing and seeing things that didn't make sense. It started within the first week, and it never stopped. I arrived in mid-afternoon on a Tuesday. The beach around the house was nearly empty. I saw maybe one older man fishing way down the coast, but otherwise, it was just open sand. The house itself looked worn but serviceable. It had a living room, a small kitchen, one bedroom, and a bathroom. There was a big glass door in the living room that led out to a small patio, and from there, you could walk right onto the sand. The kitchen had a solid wooden door that also faced the beach. It had a deadbolt and a chain lock. I brought in my boxes of equipment. I'm not a heavy packer, but I had water testing kits, sample containers, some clothes, a couple of notebooks, and my laptop. The air smelled like salt and seaweed. The wind was steady, not too strong, but enough to blow sand around if it picked up. I did a quick check around the place. The faucet in the bathroom worked, the toilet flushed, the kitchen stove was a bit old, and there was a faint odor like old grease, but it still functioned. The fridge rattled when it ran, but I could live with that. Everything looked normal enough. I spent the rest of that first day collecting a few samples from the shallow water. The sun was bright, the sky was clear, and the breeze felt good. I carried my small cooler with collected water samples back inside. I remember feeling relaxed. The isolation of the place was refreshing. My cell signal was weak, but I could still text if I needed to. I had a portable hotspot, though it sometimes cut out. That night, I locked both the kitchen door and the glass door. I checked the windows to make sure they were shut tight. I was pretty thorough about it because I had heard the wind can pick up and blow sand everywhere. Then I went to bed around midnight. The place was silent except for the distant sound of waves. Nothing weird happened that night. I woke up feeling good, made coffee, and stepped outside to get some fresh air. The day went about the same, taking samples, making notes, sorting data. The real trouble started on the third night. It was around 2 a.m, and I was asleep when I heard a thud. I sat up and listened. I thought it might be the wind or maybe something I left on the counter that fell over. I stayed in bed for a minute, debating whether to get up. I felt kind of nervous, but I tried to brush it off. After a few more seconds, I got up and went to the living room. Everything looked the way I'd left it. Then I noticed the kitchen door was wide open. The deadbolt was retracted and the chain was hanging. It wasn't broken or damaged, it was just unlocked. Outside, the sand was dark and I couldn't see any footprints directly by the doorway. I flicked on the porch light, but it didn't illuminate much. I listened for footsteps outside. There was only the sound of wind and waves. My heart was racing. My chest felt tight. I closed the door, locked it again, and tested the handle. It seemed solid. I thought maybe I was tired and forgot to lock it before bed. I told myself I must have been absent-minded. Then I double-checked the locks on the windows and the glass door again. Everything else was secure. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep for about an hour. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I felt uneasy. I reviewed in my head how I'd locked the door the night before. I was sure I'd used the deadbolt. My mind started to go over every possible explanation. Maybe the deadbolt was broken and slid open somehow, or maybe someone had a key. But I was the only one who had the keys, and the landlord lived hours away. I tried not to let it rattle me too much. Over the next few days, I kept busy with work. I took the Jeep down the coast, tested some other spots, and collected more samples. During the day, nothing strange happened. The house was silent, the breeze was pleasant, and the only sounds were from seagulls and the gentle crashing of waves. I actually started to forget about the open door incident. Then it happened again, about a week in. This time, I'd locked up everything by 11 at night. I was in bed, reading on my phone, when I heard a low creak. It was faint, but it made me sit up. I listened more. A few seconds passed, and then I heard another creak. It sounded like the kitchen door moving back and forth. My heart started to pound. I got up, grabbed the flashlight beside my bed, and crept out to the hallway. I felt the hairs on my arms rising. I could feel my pulse thumping in my neck. When I got to the kitchen, the door was open again. No damage, no sign that anyone forced it. It was just open. I felt a chill in my spine. I shined my flashlight out the door. The patio was empty. The sand was dark and still. I didn't see anyone out there. The wind was light, not strong enough to blow open a dead-bolted door. I locked it again, tested the handle, and stood there, trying to calm my breathing. I started sweating, and I noticed my hands were trembling a bit. I tried to distract myself the next morning by working on my data. I told myself I just needed to be more careful with the lock, but I tested the deadbolt during the day. I turned it multiple times, seeing if there was any catch or flaw. It clicked into place without an issue. I tried pushing on the door when it was locked, and it felt secure. I had no explanation for why it kept opening. About 3 nights after that, I was jerked awake by the sound of footsteps in the living room. They sounded soft and rhythmic, like someone was walking barefoot on the tile floor. I froze in bed, trying to convince myself it was just the fridge rattling or some trick of the wind. But the steps continued. They went from one side of the room to the other, then back again. It was a steady, deliberate pace. My heart felt like it was hammering in my chest. I felt my throat tighten, and my mouth went dry. I lay there for several minutes, trying to muster the courage to get up. I finally reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. My hands shook as I got up. I didn't call anyone because I didn't think the police would take me seriously out here, especially if there was no sign of a break-in. Plus, I wasn't even sure someone was there. There was no normal reason for anyone to be standing in my living room at 3 in the morning, pacing back and forth. I decided to check it out on my own. I crept to the door of the bedroom and listened. The footsteps continued. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. I aimed my phone's flashlight at the living room floor. I didn't see anyone. The room was dim and I could only hear my own breathing. Then I noticed wet footprints on the floor. They looked like bare feet, maybe bigger than my own. The prints were spaced in a path from the glass door to the hallway, then back again as if someone had been pacing. I stayed perfectly still, shining my light on those prints. They glistened under the beam. I could see small droplets of water next to them. My whole body felt shaky. I felt an urge to turn around, get my car keys, and drive away. But I didn't do it. Instead, I followed the footprints to where they ended near the kitchen door. Then they turned around and headed back toward the living room. They just stopped at one point right in the middle of the floor as if the person vanished. I stood there for a while watching them. After a few minutes, they started to fade. I got closer and saw that they weren't drying in a natural way. It was more like they just lost definition until there was nothing but a slight moisture on the tile. Then that was gone too. There wasn't a big puddle. There was no salt residue, no smell of seawater. The door was locked and there was no sign of forced entry. I stayed awake the rest of the night with the lights on. I sat at the small dining table, tried to read news articles on my phone, tried to write down everything I'd seen so I wouldn't second-guess myself. By sunrise, I was exhausted, but I decided I needed to keep going with my research. I couldn't just bail. I had a grant to collect certain data and my schedule was tight. I started a new routine. Every night before bed, I would triple-check the locks. I dragged a heavy chair in front of the kitchen door. I put a small piece of tape over the deadbolt to see if it moved while I slept. I went so far as to put a little bell from the living room shelf on the chair so that if the chair moved, the bell would fall and ring. I was determined to catch whatever was happening. For 2 nights, nothing occurred. I actually began to think I'd scared off whoever was messing with me. Then, on the 3rd night of this new system, I woke up around 2 in the morning with that same feeling of unease. It was that gnawing sensation in my stomach, like I wasn't alone. I listened carefully. The house was silent. I got up and checked the living room with a flashlight. The chair was still there. The bell was still on top. The tape over the deadbolt looked undisturbed. I saw no footprints. I started to feel relief. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed the door, I tested the handle. It was still locked. Then I heard a scrape on the living room floor, as if something heavy was dragged for half a second. I whipped around and aimed my flashlight. I saw nothing. My heart pounded. I stepped into the living room, shining the light into every corner. The glass door was locked. The windows were closed. Everything was in order. I looked at the floor where I thought the noise had come from. Nothing was there. I stood still for a moment, listening to my own rapid breathing. Then I checked the hallway, the bathroom, and the bedroom. The entire house seemed empty. I returned to the kitchen, took my glass of water, and brought it back to the bedroom. I locked my bedroom door, though I knew that probably wouldn't stop anything if it came down to it. But it made me feel a small sense of control. Over the next week, the open-door incidents were less frequent. I think it happened only once more, and it was the same story. Deadbolt undone, door open, no signs of forced entry. I kept using the chair and the bell every night. Sometimes I would wake up in the morning and find everything as I left it. Other times the door would be open, but the chair and bell were untouched. There were never any footprints in the sand right outside the door, which made no sense to me. The footsteps inside continued on random nights. I would hear them pacing or shuffling, and I'd freeze in bed waiting for them to stop. Sometimes I would get up right away and see nothing. Other times I'd try to ignore it until morning. The footprints on the floor didn't appear every night, but I saw them enough times that I stopped doubting my own eyes. Physically, I felt worn down. My back was sore from tension, and I had headaches from lack of sleep. Mentally, I was on edge all the time. I kept looking over my shoulder while working in the house, expecting to catch some intruder, but I never did. My phone battery stayed charged because I barely used it, aside from daily check-ins. Most calls were quick. I was too embarrassed to go on about my experiences. I was worried people would dismiss me as paranoid. After a full month, my research was almost complete. I decided I'd pack up and leave as soon as I finished the last set of water samples. On my final night, I followed the same routine. I locked everything, put the chair and bell in place, taped the deadbolt, and went to bed early. I woke up around 3 in the morning. My room was dark, and I felt a wave of dread immediately. I listened for footsteps. I heard nothing. Then I realized I was cold, even though it wasn't a chilly night. I checked my phone. No new messages, no missed calls. I turned on the lamp and walked into the living room. The door was shut, the bell still on the chair, the tape still there. No footprints on the floor. I stood there for a moment, just scanning the living room. My chest felt tight, and my pulse was fast. I took a few steps toward the kitchen, and that's when I saw the faint outline of wet footprints near the glass door. They were already fading, like they'd just been made seconds ago. They led to the door and disappeared at the threshold. The glass door was still locked. I watched the footprints vanish in front of my eyes. They left no residue, no wet smell, nothing. The tile was dry seconds later. That morning, I packed my gear and loaded the Jeep before sunrise. I left the key on the table, sent a text to the landlord that I was done early, and drove off without looking back. I still don't have a clear explanation for what happened in that house. All I can say is that I checked those doors and they kept opening. I heard footsteps and I saw footprints that vanished. Whatever was going on in that house, it's not something I can explain with normal logic. I haven't been back, and I don't plan to. I got the data I needed and finished my reports. But the memory of those open doors and those disappearing footprints still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. I moved into that old building because the rent was a lot lower than anywhere else in town. The landlord told me they had just renovated it and were eager to get new tenants. I didn't question it. I just wanted a place to live without wasting half my salary. I noticed the walls were a bit thin, and the hallway lights flickered sometimes, but I figured it was part of the charm. I had no idea what I was getting into. My unit was on the 4th floor. The hallway smelled like paint and cleaning chemicals for the first couple of weeks. I was told there were only a few people living on my floor. It seemed quiet. I worked long hours, so I didn't mind the lack of interaction. I'd come home, lock my door, and settle in for the night. At first, nothing bothered me. I heard some creaking from the pipes, but that's normal in older buildings. After about a week, I started hearing footsteps. They came from the apartment next to mine. I thought it was just a neighbor coming home late. The steps had a slow, steady rhythm, like someone pacing around a living room. This happened around 2 in the morning. I remember lying in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to those footsteps. They were close enough that I could tell they were right on the other side of the wall. I tried to ignore them and fell asleep. The next day, I asked the building's manager, who was also the superintendent, if someone had moved in next door. He looked confused and said no. He said the previous tenant had moved out a few months ago and that place was still empty. That caught me off guard. I asked if maybe he was mistaken, but he shook his head. He offered to show me the log of who lived in which unit. No one was listed for that apartment. I walked away feeling uneasy. For a few nights after that conversation, I slept with earplugs. The footsteps still showed up around 2 in the morning. They lasted for maybe 15 minutes each time, then stopped. Some nights, I didn't wake up at all. Other nights, they were loud enough that I took out the earplugs and just listened. The building was quiet, so it was easy to focus on that single noise. No voices, no TV, just footsteps. One evening, I heard a different sound. It was a metallic clink like a pipe or a spoon tapping against a metal surface. It came from the same apartment. It echoed through the wall. I jumped up, worried about a water leak or a pipe problem. I checked under my sink and around my kitchen for any drips. Nothing. The sound kept going in short bursts. I decided to step outside to see if I could hear it better from the hallway. When I got outside, the corridor was dark. The overhead light near my door was working, but the one near the other apartment was out. I walked toward my neighbor's door. It was shut and looked locked. I pressed my ear against it for a moment. The clinking was definitely coming from inside. I didn't hear water running, though. It sounded like metal hitting metal. I knocked. No one answered. I waited, my heart pounding. After a few seconds of silence, the clinking started up again. I felt goosebumps on my arms. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I went downstairs and found the superintendent in the lobby. He was sorting mail. I told him there was a noise in the empty apartment. He sighed and said there was no one there, so it must be the plumbing. He grabbed a large ring of keys and followed me back up. When we reached the door, the noise had stopped. He looked at me like I was imagining things, but I insisted there had been a distinct tapping. He put his ear against the door, frowned, and shrugged. He didn't unlock it. He said he didn't want to enter without a reason. Then he went back downstairs. I felt stupid. For the next few days, I tried to forget about it. Work was stressful. I came home late, ate a quick dinner, and went to bed. The footsteps happened again that week, but I didn't bother reporting it anymore. It felt like no one believed me, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. Then, one night, I smelled coffee. It was strong, like fresh coffee from a percolator. I was in my living room watching a late-night show when the smell drifted through the wall. I paused the TV and sniffed the air. It definitely smelled like coffee. I walked to my kitchen, checked my own coffee maker, which was empty. The smell was coming from the neighbor's wall, the one that separated our kitchens. It grew stronger, like someone had just brewed a full pot. I could almost feel the warmth of it. Then it suddenly vanished. The odor didn't fade gradually. It was just gone. I stood there in silence, feeling the hair on my neck standing up. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about how no one was supposed to be in that apartment. If it was empty, there shouldn't be any activity. There shouldn't be lights on, no cooking, no footsteps, no tapping. But I heard things and smelled things. The next morning, I asked the superintendent to check the electricity meter for that unit. He went with me to the basement where the meters were lined up in a locked cabinet. He opened the door, pointed to the meter number for my neighbor's unit, and showed me it wasn't running. It was at 0 usage. No lights, no appliances, nothing. I felt confused. If there was no electricity, how could anyone be brewing coffee in there? The superintendent said he had no idea. Maybe the smell came through the vents from another apartment, but that didn't explain why it smelled so strong right by our shared wall. And it didn't explain the footsteps. He said old buildings have strange quirks. Then he joked that maybe the place was haunted. I didn't laugh. I just asked him to let me know if anyone ever rented that unit. Another month went by. I tried to focus on my own life. I went to work, saw friends on weekends, and tried not to think about that empty place next door. But every now and then, in the middle of the night, I'd wake up to the sound of footsteps. Sometimes they were slow and steady. Other times they were quicker, like someone was moving with urgency. I never heard voices, I never saw any lights under the door. But something was happening in there. My anxiety got worse. I started checking the hallway before I left for work, just to see if there were any signs of someone moving in. The door always looked the same, with no decorations or changes. I didn't see new locks or notes taped to it. The mail slot was empty. No one came or went. I even asked neighbors on different floors if they had seen anyone. They all said no. They barely noticed any movement in our building. Most people kept to themselves. One night, around 3 a.m, I heard something that made my heart race more than ever. It sounded like furniture being dragged across a floor. The noise was heavy and grating. It made my walls vibrate. I got out of bed, put on slippers, and opened my door. The hallway was silent. I walked over to the neighbor's door. It was still closed. I listened carefully. I heard a scraping sound inside, but it was faint. My palms were sweaty. I felt my pulse throbbing in my neck. I grabbed my phone and thought about calling the superintendent again, but it was so late. I also knew he'd be annoyed. After a minute of standing there, I turned around and went back to my apartment. I decided I wasn't going to let this continue without some explanation. The following morning, I got up early and waited for the superintendent by the lobby. He showed up around 7, and I told him everything. He looked more concerned this time, probably because I looked exhausted and on edge. He offered to check the apartment with me if I felt that was necessary. I said yes. He grabbed the keys, and we went up to the 4th floor together. I held my breath while he fit a master key into the neighbor's lock. When the door opened, I felt a cold breeze rush out. I stepped inside behind him. The place smelled stale. Dust motes floated in the air. The apartment was small, just like mine. We walked through each room. The living room was empty except for a single wooden chair in the corner. The kitchen had no appliances other than the built-in cabinets. There was no coffee maker. The countertops were clean. The bathroom was bare. The bedroom had an ancient-looking wardrobe, but it was empty. The entire space looked untouched. No lights were on, and there were no signs of recent occupation. We stood there, listening to the silence. I kept expecting some hidden person to appear, but there was nothing. The superintendent nodded at me like he wanted me to see there was no one. I felt a bit embarrassed. I even touched the walls, trying to see if anything was loose. Everything seemed solid. There was a slight chill in the place, but it felt like an unused room with no heating. After we finished looking around, we left, and he locked the door again. He said he would have heard about any new tenant, so there was no chance someone was sneaking in at night. He told me to get some rest and not to worry so much. Over the next few days, I forced myself to ignore any noises. Whenever I heard a creak or a thump, I told myself it was just the old building settling. I tried to sleep with white noise playing on my phone. I tried wearing thicker earplugs. I focused on work, hoping the sounds would vanish if I didn't pay attention to them. It didn't help much. I still heard footsteps every few nights. I didn't call the superintendent anymore. I didn't have any proof besides my own ears. My mood started swinging. Some days, I felt jumpy. Other days, I just felt worn out. I hated walking past that door. It was always locked, always dark. But late at night, I'd hear someone moving inside. At one point, I thought maybe I was losing my mind. I wondered if the stress of work or lack of sleep was messing with me. I considered moving out, but I couldn't afford a higher rent somewhere else. This was my cheapest option. One night, the smell of coffee returned. It was as strong as before. I was sitting in the kitchen, eating a sandwich, and the smell hit me so hard I gagged. I dropped my sandwich and pressed my nose against the wall. It felt warm, like there was heat on the other side. My stomach churned. I put my hand on the wall. It vibrated slightly, like something was running behind it. Then the smell disappeared again. I just stood there feeling sweat drip down my forehead. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 2:13 in the morning. That was the moment I decided I needed a break. I called a friend who lived across town and asked if I could crash on his couch for a weekend. He agreed. I threw some clothes in a bag and left the building before midnight on Friday. I spent 2 nights at my friend's place. I slept better, but I couldn't stop thinking about the apartment. I kept replaying the noises, the smells, the tension I felt in that hallway. When I returned Sunday evening, the hallway was quiet. I checked my mailbox, climbed the stairs, and walked to my door. I paused next to the neighbor's apartment. Nothing. I unlocked my door, went inside, and sat on the couch. For a few hours, I felt normal again. I watched some TV, made dinner, and tried to relax. Then, just as I started to get drowsy, I heard faint footsteps against the shared wall. They didn't last long. They were gone within a minute. I turned off the TV and sat in silence, waiting for another sound. Everything stayed quiet. I still live here. It's been months and no one has moved into the apartment next door. The superintendent says it's vacant. He's shown it to a few people, but they always turn it down. Sometimes I see him leading a potential tenant inside during the day. I always wonder if they sense anything off in there. At night, I still hear occasional sounds, though it's less frequent. I try not to let it consume me. I don't mention it to the superintendent anymore. I just focus on my life, on my rent, on my bills. I can't explain those noises or the smell of coffee. I don't have any evidence of someone living there. The walls still feel too thin. The hallway light still flickers. Every so often, I tap my own wall, waiting to hear a response. Sometimes there's nothing. Sometimes I hear something faint like a tap back. But it's never clear. Maybe it's the pipes. Maybe it's my imagination. All I know is that apartment remains locked and empty. I haven't seen anyone enter or leave. I keep telling myself that if it was something dangerous, the building staff would have found out by now. But late at night, when the footsteps start, my heart still pounds and my skin goes cold. I feel like I'm not alone, even though I'm supposed to be. I just deal with it. That's my reality in this building. I don't have another place lined up, and the rent is still the cheapest option I have. So I stay. I keep my door locked, and I try not to think about what's going on next door. When I hear the footsteps, I wait for them to stop. When I smell the coffee, I open a window to clear my head. And every time I pass that door, I wonder who or what might be inside, even though everyone insists it's empty. That night, I just wanted to dodge traffic. I left for the mountains way later than usual. I figured if I started my drive after midnight, I could avoid the endless lines of cars and trucks that usually clog the highway. I was tired, but I needed to get there for a work meeting early the next morning. I expected a quiet, uneventful trip. I got something else instead. I left home around 11:30 p.m. The streets in my neighborhood were empty. I drove past a few closed stores and a gas station that was about to shut down. I felt a small rush of excitement as I headed for the highway. There's a certain calm that comes from driving late at night when the roads are quiet. My shoulders felt loose, and the steering wheel felt steady in my hands. I wanted to maintain that peaceful feeling for as long as possible. Once I got on the main highway, I settled into a comfortable speed. My car isn't fancy, but it's reliable. The engine hummed in a low, even tone. The headlights illuminated the asphalt for a good distance ahead, and there were tall mountains off in the distance, their dark silhouettes barely visible against the night sky. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was almost midnight. I told myself I'd reach the small city in the mountains by 2 in the morning at the latest. I rolled down my window a few inches for fresh air. The night air was cool, and it felt good on my face. My eyes were a bit dry, so I blinked a few times. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was steady, and the faint sound of the wind rushed past. The highway was wide, and I could see a few lights from passing trucks going in the opposite direction. I didn't think much of anything unusual. As I got closer to the mountain region, the road started to curve more. The signs warned of sharp bends and steep inclines. I slowed down a bit. I leaned forward, trying to see as far ahead as possible. The guardrails glinted under my headlights. I felt a slight tension in my neck as I gripped the wheel. Driving through these twists and turns at night always makes me a little uneasy, but I kept a steady hand. I noticed something in my rearview mirror after one of the sharper curves. At first, it was just a single small light. It looked like a headlight from a motorcycle. The beam was distant. I thought, okay, there's a bike behind me. Good to know I'm not alone out here. I relaxed a bit, knowing at least there was another person on the road. I didn't think it was a big deal. Maybe the rider had the same idea as me about avoiding traffic. I kept glancing back to see if the motorcycle would catch up. It never did. It stayed the same distance behind me, that single headlight never growing larger or smaller. Every time I took a sharper turn, the headlight would vanish behind the rock face or the thick trees, then pop up again in the mirror once I straightened out. It always remained in the same spot relative to me. It never got any closer. I started to feel a bit uneasy. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. It was just a small knot in my stomach, a question forming in my head. Why doesn't that guy catch up or slow down? I thought maybe the rider was just being cautious around the bends. I tried not to think too hard about it. I focused on driving carefully. The road had very little shoulder at some parts, and the drop-off on the left side looked pretty intimidating under the faint moonlight. After another 10 minutes or so, I noticed the headlight was still there at the exact same distance. I decided I would pull over if I found a safe stretch of road. That way, I could let the motorcycle pass me. There was no reason to let it linger behind me if it wanted to go faster. Part of me just wanted to confirm that this was an actual bike with a rider. Finally, I saw a slightly wider section of the shoulder ahead. I slowed down, turned on my right blinker, and eased the car to a stop. My hands felt a bit sweaty on the steering wheel. The tires crunched against the gravel at the roadside. My heart thumped a little faster. I inhaled and exhaled, trying to keep calm. The night was quiet. I turned off my music and listened for the sound of an engine or anything at all. For a few seconds, I heard nothing but the breeze rustling some branches in the distance. I waited for the motorcycle to pass, but no one passed me. My rearview mirror was pitch black. I shifted in my seat, trying to look over my shoulder. The road behind me was empty. My chest felt tight, and I started wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the rider had turned off at some earlier fork in the road. After a moment, I flipped on my turn signal again and got back onto the highway. My headlights illuminated the mountain road once more. I picked up speed, staying within the limit, but moving steadily. My mind kept going back to that single headlight. I scanned my mirrors more often now. For a while, I saw nothing. The tension in my body eased a bit. My grip on the steering wheel relaxed. Then about 10 minutes later, I saw the headlight again in the rearview mirror. Same distance, same angle. It looked identical to before. My breath hitched. I felt a sudden rush of adrenaline, and my shoulders tensed up again. I tried to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a car with only one functioning headlight, but it really did look like a motorcycle beam. Still, I didn't hear any engine noise, and it didn't appear to be gaining on me or falling back. I turned on my high beams, hoping to catch some reflection off the vehicle's body if it got closer, but the road behind me stayed dark. Only that one light shone back at me. My stomach churned. My mouth felt dry. I swallowed hard and decided to focus on the road. The curves were getting tighter and the road began to climb. I couldn't risk any mistakes. I kept glancing at the mirror every few seconds, though. The light stayed there. The night air that had felt cool before now felt cold on my face. I realized I'd rolled the window down a bit more at some point, maybe hoping to wake myself up or calm myself down. I noticed my hands trembling slightly when I turned the steering wheel. I tried to breathe slowly, in and out. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. There always is. There must be some perfectly normal reason for this. I repeated that in my head a few times, but I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. After another stretch of road, I reached a straight section. I pressed the accelerator a little more, hoping maybe I could widen the distance or see if the light would move. I felt the car jerk slightly as I accelerated. The engine made a deeper sound. My car surged forward, but that headlight stayed the same distance behind me. It didn't fade, and it didn't get closer. It stayed locked in position. My throat tightened and my heart hammered against my ribcage. I could feel my pulse in my temples. I reached another bend. As soon as I started turning, the light disappeared. The mirror went black. Then, once I straightened out, the light reappeared. I let out a shaky breath. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck. My seat felt hot even though the night was cool. The significance of this pattern made my thoughts race. If it were a normal bike, sometimes it would be behind a curve. Sometimes it would pop into view, but eventually it should vary the distance. I tried to calm myself by thinking about my schedule for the next day. I had a meeting at a plant in the city up here, and then I'd have some site visits. That was the whole reason I took this route. That was the reason I was on the road so late. I didn't want to get stuck in rush hour traffic, so this was my plan. But my mind kept drifting back to the reflection in the mirror. I thought about stopping again, but now I was too nervous to pull over without a clear rest stop or gas station. I didn't see many safe spots on this mountain road. I told myself to keep going until I reached the city. I knew that once I got off the highway and onto the well-lit streets, I could confirm what was behind me. The presence of other vehicles and some streetlights would give me a better view. For the next half hour, I repeated this cycle of seeing the light, losing it, and seeing it again. Every time it appeared, my muscles tensed up. My palms were slick with sweat, and I had to wipe them on my pants when I had a chance. The road seemed to go on forever. The pine trees on the sides looked like tall shadows in my peripheral vision. My high beams cut through the darkness, revealing the winding path in front of me. I saw deer crossing signs, but no actual deer. I saw stray rocks that had fallen from the mountain, but not many cars. It was so isolated. When I finally approached the outskirts of the city, I felt a wave of relief. The highway merged into a more urban road. Streetlights popped up in the distance. I saw the glow reflecting on some store signs and parking lots. A few buildings stood along the road, their windows dark at this hour. I slowed down a bit, trying to maneuver onto the right ramp that would take me into the city center. As I shifted lanes, I glanced in my mirror. The headlight was gone. I flicked my eyes back and forth between the side mirror and the rearview mirror, trying to find a trace of it. I saw nothing. Cars were parked along the curb on some side streets. A couple of traffic lights glowed red in the distance, but there was no single headlight that resembled a motorcycle. My body relaxed, and I noticed my heartbeat was still rapid. I swallowed a lump in my throat. I turned onto a well-lit road near a gas station. The neon sign cast a bright glow over the street. I pulled into the station, parked next to a pump, and turned off the engine. My hands were slightly shaky, and my knees felt stiff from the tension. I sat there for a moment, rubbing my eyes. The overhead lights at the gas station buzzed quietly. I inhaled and exhaled, trying to settle my nerves. My throat felt dry, so I got out of the car and stretched my arms. The cool air hit me again, but it didn't feel quite so chilling now that I was near civilization. The fluorescent lights revealed the front of my car, which was covered in dust and bugs. The windshield was speckled, but otherwise everything looked normal. I glanced around the gas station and saw no motorcycles, no other cars that looked suspicious. Just an empty, well-lit area. I decided to fill up the tank even though I still had half left. I needed a minute to compose myself. I reached for the pump and started refueling. I listened for any sound of a bike. Nothing. I heard the quiet hum of the gas station's overhead lights and distant traffic somewhere deeper in the city. My heart rate finally slowed. I wiped a bit of sweat from my forehead with my sleeve. The gas pump clicked off and I replaced the nozzle. I walked inside the station's convenience store, got a bottle of water, and paid the cashier. The cashier barely looked at me. He seemed tired. I guess working the overnight shift can do that. Back in the car, I took a long sip of water. I thought about what happened on that mountain highway. It didn't make sense. I had seen a light that stayed behind me for miles, never catching up, never dropping back. When I pulled over, nothing passed me. It kept reappearing, then disappearing. And when I finally reached the city limits, it vanished for good. I never saw who or what was behind me. I decided to continue on to my hotel. I felt more comfortable on the city streets with streetlights and a few cars around. Every so often I glanced in the mirror, half expecting to see that lonely headlight pop up again. It never did. The drive took another 15 minutes, and by the time I parked at the hotel, it was almost 2:30 a.m. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, locked the car, and headed into the lobby. The hotel clerk gave me my room key without much small talk. I was too tired to explain why I looked so rattled. My legs felt heavy as I trudged to the elevator. Once inside my room, I tossed my bag on the chair, kicked off my shoes, and sank down on the bed. The exhaustion hit me hard, but my mind kept replaying the image of that headlight in the rearview mirror. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the air conditioning unit clicking and humming. There was no explanation for what happened, at least not one I could come up with right then. Eventually, I dozed off. The next morning, I woke up to my alarm and got ready for my meeting. I tried to brush off the lingering tension in my chest, but it stayed with me. All day when I was driving around the city for appointments, I found myself checking my mirror more than usual. No single headlight followed me in the city traffic. No strange vehicle seemed to linger at the same distance. Everything felt normal under the daylight. I still don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a motorcycle with a nervous rider who kept his distance. Maybe it was a car with only one working headlight. Maybe it was something else. All I know is that it kept the same distance behind me no matter how fast or slow I went, and it disappeared whenever I stopped or whenever the curves got too sharp. When I think about that night, I can still feel my pulse quickening and the sweat building on my palms. I remember the moment when I pulled over and saw nothing behind me, even though a second earlier the headlight was in my mirror. I kept my usual driving schedule for work trips after that. I still go to the mountains for meetings now and then, but I avoid taking that particular highway late at night. I don't like the twisting roads in the dark anymore, and I don't want to see that light again. If I have no choice, I sometimes catch myself focusing on my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a faint beam trailing behind me. So far, it hasn't returned. I'll probably never find out who or what followed me that night, but if I ever see that light again, I might try to flag it down, or even risk stepping out of my car in the darkness. Until then, all I can do is remember the way it made my heart pound and my mouth go dry. I remember that slow, creeping sense of dread, and I remember that it vanished as soon as I turned onto a bright, well-lit road. No matter what caused it, I know I saw that headlight in my mirror for miles, and that's enough to make me question every empty stretch of highway whenever I drive alone at night. I still feel a chill on my neck when I think about that night. It started like any routine evening, with me staying behind after everyone else left the building. I was organizing a small event in a commercial building that had a basement auditorium. I was responsible for the sound setup and all the audio checks, so I usually wrapped up later than the rest of the staff. That meant I had to lock up, turn off the lights, and make sure everything was secured. I never had a problem before. The building was simple. The auditorium was just a few flights of stairs below ground level, and the rest of the rooms were for offices and storage. There was nothing fancy about the place, but that night, something felt different from the moment I heard the first strange sound. I was in the control room next to the stage, checking cables, adjusting mixers, and verifying the speaker positions. The event was small, but I liked to be thorough. I took pride in keeping the audio crisp and balanced. By the time I was done, it was close to 9 p.m., and everyone else had already left. My stomach growled, and I realized I hadn't eaten since noon. So I started thinking about grabbing a late bite on my way home. My plan was to finalize a few last checks, switch off the system, and head out. I left the control room and walked down the hallway leading back to the elevator. The corridor was plain, with a low ceiling and a dull gray carpet. My footsteps made a soft thump on that carpet, and there was a faint echo that followed me. As I passed by a row of closed doors that led to storage closets, I heard something. It sounded like low voices, but they were muffled, like they were coming through the walls. I paused and listened. At first, I wondered if a security guard or a late-working colleague was still around. But the building's security staff usually stayed near the entrance on the ground floor. Nobody ever hung out in the basement unless there was a reason. I looked around. The hallway was lit by fluorescent lights, and the doors were all shut. I stepped closer to the door of the closest storage room and pressed my ear against it. I heard nothing. My shoulders felt tense, so I rolled them back to loosen up. My pulse was steady, but there was a nagging feeling at the base of my skull, like I was being watched. The building was quiet, almost too quiet, except for a low hum from the ventilation system. I told myself it was just the echo of my own movements. I shook my head and kept walking. When I reached the elevator, I pressed the call button and waited. While I stood there, I kept glancing over my shoulder. It felt like someone was behind me. The hairs on my arm stood up and my mouth went a bit dry, but I didn't see anyone. I checked my phone, scrolled through some messages, and tried to distract myself. The elevator arrived, I got in, and I headed up to the main lobby. I stepped out, saw the security desk was empty, and figured the guard might be on his patrol upstairs. I took a quick walk around the lobby, saw no one, and decided not to wait. I planned to leave and let the guard handle his usual routine. I remembered I had left my phone charger in the auditorium, so I went back down. When I returned to the basement, I noticed the hallway felt cooler than before. I heard a slight buzzing sound, and I figured it was probably the ventilation or one of the lights. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. I opened the door to the auditorium, stepped inside, and walked down the aisle toward the stage. The place smelled like stale air, with a faint hint of carpet cleaner. The seats were arranged in neat rows, all empty. I could hear my own footsteps echo. My charger was next to the control booth. I grabbed it, tucked it in my jacket pocket, and turned to leave. Before I walked away, I noticed the sound system's main power light was still on. I was certain I had shut it down earlier. I felt a twinge of annoyance. I prided myself on being meticulous, so I blamed my fatigue and decided to check the settings. I walked onto the stage, knelt by the control panel, and saw the microphone channel was active. There was a soft static crackling in the speakers. It was that faint buzz you get when a mic is on, but not picking up any clear voice. The volume sliders were all over the place. Someone had moved them. That was odd because I had my own standard configuration for everything, and I had spent the last hour making sure it was perfect. My heartbeat picked up a bit. I looked around, shining the flashlight from my phone under the chairs and the side curtains. Nobody was there. I walked backstage to see if there was a small room I hadn't checked. It was empty. The place was dim, lit only by a few emergency lights. My shoes scraped the concrete floor, and every step echoed off the cinder block walls. I didn't see or hear anything besides my own movements, but I felt my skin prickle with goosebumps. The silence was too heavy. I returned to the control panel and switched off the main power for the audio system. The static cut out immediately. My hands felt a little shaky, and I wiped the sweat off my palms on my jeans. Then I noticed the microphone lying on the stage floor. It was pointed toward the seats, as if someone had dropped it or placed it down hastily. I remembered putting all the microphones on their stands earlier. This one shouldn't have been left on the ground. I picked it up and clicked it off. There was a faint warmth on the grip, like someone had been holding it not too long ago. That unsettled me. I tried to stay calm and logical. Maybe I bumped it earlier, or maybe I had left it out. But I couldn't recall doing that. I decided to do one more sweep of the auditorium to make sure nobody was around. The overhead lights were off, so I walked slowly, using my phone's flashlight to scan the rows of seats. The beam of light slid across the backs of the chairs, revealing red upholstery and the occasional speck of dust floating in the air. Everything was quiet. My breathing sounded loud in my ears and my heart thudded in my chest. Every time the floor creaked under my weight, I paused, thinking I heard another step behind me. I checked the corners near the exit doors on the sides of the stage. Those doors led to a small backstage area and an emergency staircase. Both were locked from the inside. There was no sign that anyone had used them. I tested the knobs. They were secure. I glanced at the fire escape map on the wall, just to be sure I wasn't missing another door. There were no other entry points except the main entrance I had come through. That door was still propped open with a small wedge. I took out the wedge and let the door close behind me. Then I pulled on it from the inside. It was locked. By that point, my gut was telling me to get out of there. I had already turned off the system, checked for people, and locked the door. I couldn't think of any reason to stay, but a stubborn part of me insisted on being sure everything was in order. I walked back toward the stage to confirm that no cables were plugged into the console that might cause interference. That's when I noticed something else. The main mixer sliders were back in a different position than I had left them just a minute ago. It was subtle, only a few were moved, but it was enough for me to notice. I froze in place. My breathing became shallow. My arms felt tense and I clenched my fists. For a second I stood completely still, straining my ears for any movement. The stage lights were off, so I had only the small glow from the aisle lights to see by. My phone flashlight was still on, but it barely illuminated the control panel. The silence was overwhelming. Then I thought I heard a faint whisper right behind me. It was too quiet to make out the words. It sounded like someone exhaling or barely muttering something. I spun around, phone flashlight stretched out in front of me, but I saw nothing. I felt adrenaline flood my system. My legs wanted to run, but I forced myself to walk, even though my steps were hurried. I backed away from the stage, keeping my eyes on every dark corner I could see. My mind was racing, wondering if there was some stranger hiding in the building. I told myself it could be a homeless person seeking shelter or maybe a prankster, but the heavier part of me suspected it was something else. I don't usually jump to conclusions, but the entire situation felt too strange. I made my way to the exit door, pushed it open, and stepped into the hallway. The corridor was still lit by those harsh fluorescent lights. They flickered once, then settled. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a slight relief at being out of the auditorium. I locked the door behind me and double-checked that it wouldn't open from the other side. Then I headed for the elevator again, my shoes making quick sounds on the carpet. My mouth was dry, and my heart was still pounding. I jammed the elevator button and the wait felt long. The hallway was silent, but I kept imagining sounds. I heard a faint hum, maybe from the building's air system. Then I thought I heard a single footstep behind me. I turned around, but it was just the same empty corridor. My stomach felt tight. I tapped my foot impatiently until the elevator arrived. When the doors slid open, I got in and pressed the button for the main floor. As the elevator started to move, I kept my back to the wall. I stared at the door, half expecting it to open on a random floor, but it went straight up to the lobby. The doors opened, and the overhead lights in the lobby felt much brighter. My heart rate slowed a bit. I spotted the security guard coming in from the front entrance, a thermos in his hand. He nodded at me. I nodded back, not sure whether I should tell him what happened. I didn't want to sound paranoid, and I also didn't want to stay there any longer. I just wanted to leave. So I walked toward the main exit, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the night air. The cold breeze hit my face. I inhaled deeply and felt my shoulders relax a bit. As I headed to my car, I kept looking back over my shoulder at the building. The windows on the upper floors were dark. The basement obviously had no windows, but I kept imagining I'd see a light flick on below ground. Nothing happened, though. I got in my car, turned the key, and drove off. My mind raced the whole drive home, replaying the odd movements of the sliders, the static on the microphone, and the feeling of being watched. At home, I showered and tried to settle in. I forced myself to watch some mindless TV to distract my thoughts, but I couldn't stop replaying those moments in my head. I remembered how the microphone felt warm, how the control panel was different every time I looked, and how I heard that whisper. My body kept reacting, with my neck tense and my stomach churning. Sleep came late and was restless. When I returned to work the next morning, I asked the security guard if he had seen anything strange on the cameras. He shrugged, said everything looked normal. He didn't mention hearing any voices or footsteps, and nobody reported staying in the building after hours. I went down to the auditorium with a knot in my stomach, but in the morning light, it seemed ordinary. The lights were on, the seats were empty, and the stage was just a stage. The control panel was back to my usual settings, the main power was off, and everything looked undisturbed. I flicked the switches, tested a microphone, and got only the usual hiss of static before I turned the volume up. Nothing strange happened. Still, I couldn't forget that feeling of someone whispering just behind my ear. I never figured out how those sliders got moved. I never found any evidence of forced entry. Nobody reported tampering with the system. There were no security alerts, no sign of a person hiding in the building. Some people I told said it was probably my nerves playing tricks on me. Others suggested there might have been a wiring issue or a glitch in the soundboard. I can't fully explain any of it. All I know is that I was alone in that basement, and something else seemed to be there too. From that night on, I never stayed in that basement auditorium without triple-checking every room and every closet. I told the event organizer that I preferred to leave at the same time as everyone else, even if I had to come in earlier to finish my tasks. Sometimes they teased me about it, but I didn't care. I still get a knot in my stomach when I think about walking those halls alone. The memory of that faint whisper and that warm microphone grip lingers in my mind. It was just a small event in a regular commercial building, but I'll always remember how the air felt thick with tension, how my breath caught in my throat, and how I locked that door, hoping nothing else would follow me out. I wasn't expecting anything unusual when I first shoved open the attic hatch. I just needed a place to store a few boxes of old books. My house is a single-story building, not very large, and the attic is cramped and dark. It's been there since I moved in, but I never bothered with it. I always figured it was too tight and dusty to be worth the trouble. Then I ran out of storage space in my bedroom closet, and the garage was already full of tools, so I had no choice but to use the attic. That decision changed everything. I dragged a stepladder to the hallway directly under the small rectangular door in the ceiling. I pushed the hatch open with one hand while holding my flashlight in the other. A musty smell hit me right away, like stale air and dry wood. I propped the hatch so it wouldn't slam shut on my head, then slowly climbed up. The beam from my flashlight lit up cobwebs, wooden beams, and a thin layer of dust covering almost everything. I could see a few boards laid across the ceiling joists, creating a rough makeshift floor. The headspace was low, so I had to stoop. My back brushed against the rafters if I stood up too straight. It felt cramped. I heard the faint rustle of something in the darkness, maybe an insect or a small animal, but I never saw it. That's when I realized there was more junk up there than I expected. A few old boxes sat in a corner. There was a broken lamp with a torn lampshade leaning against the insulation. I noticed a cracked mirror, too. It was face down, so I could only see the splintered edges of the frame. I set my boxes of books near the far side. As I put them down, my flashlight caught a dusty pile of cassette tapes. They were in a small cardboard box that looked damp around the edges, like it had gotten wet at some point. Right next to it was a cassette recorder, the kind people used decades ago. I felt a flicker of curiosity. I hadn't seen a cassette recorder in a long time. On a whim, I decided to check if it worked. I lifted the recorder and blew off some dust. It felt heavy in my hands. There were 5 or 6 tapes in total. I picked one at random and slid it into the recorder. I pressed the play button. Static came through the tiny built-in speaker. I leaned closer. Nothing else came out, just blank noise. I tried another tape. Same thing. Then I tried a third. I almost turned it off again because I only heard more static. That's when I heard a faint voice like a low whisper. It was a man's voice. He sounded angry, like he was spitting words between his teeth. I listened carefully. He said something like, "This is my place, don't come here." That's all I could make out. It sounded garbled and quiet, but it was a complaint about someone entering his space. I felt a chill on the back of my neck. It was so unexpected, and the voice was so tense. I couldn't tell if it was a recording of some argument or if it was a prank. Either way, it made me uneasy. I took a step back and switched off the recorder. Suddenly, the attic felt tighter. The air felt warmer. I glanced around, shining the flashlight on the low ceiling and the beams. I felt like someone might be behind me, even though the attic was empty except for old junk. I decided I didn't want to linger. I tossed the tapes back into the box, slid the recorder in on top, and put it all against the wall. I had enough of that creepy atmosphere. I told myself it was just an old recording from a previous owner, maybe some homemade thing. I climbed back down, shut the hatch, and tried to forget about it. For the rest of the day, I kept getting a nagging feeling that the whisper meant something. I told myself it was nonsense. That night, I lay in bed watching a show on my phone. It was past midnight when I turned off the lights. A few minutes after I settled in, I heard a noise. It was a soft thump from above, like a box being nudged. My heart jumped a bit, but I told myself it was probably the house settling. Then I heard it again. It wasn't loud. It was more like a gentle tap, tap, tap. It sounded deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers. I froze. I listened harder, but it stopped. I spent another hour awake, just staring at the ceiling. Eventually, I dozed off. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. Houses creak. Attics get rodents sometimes. I made some coffee and tried to move on with my day. But a few times, I thought I heard faint movement above me. It made my skin crawl. I decided to go up again in the afternoon. I wanted to see if maybe a raccoon or a squirrel had found its way inside. I brought the flashlight and a broomstick. I wasn't sure what I planned to do if I found an animal, but I felt better carrying something. I climbed the ladder, pushed the hatch open, and stuck my head inside. The attic was dim and musty, the same as before. I took a cautious step onto the boards. I surveyed everything. The boxes of my books were untouched, no sign of chewing or claw marks. I checked the corners, no nest or droppings. I moved slowly, shining the flashlight around, searching for any hole or crack. Then I noticed the cassette recorder. Before, I had placed it against the wall near the tapes. Now it was in the middle of the floor. It was a few feet away from where I left it. I felt panic clench my gut. I stood there, breathing shallowly. The dust on the floorboards was disturbed in a small patch right where the recorder now rested. It looked like it had been set down, not kicked over. My hands felt clammy. I couldn't think of a logical explanation. I picked up the recorder. It felt cold in my hands, even though the attic was warm. I turned it over to see if the battery cover was still in place. It was. The tapes were all in the box, though I didn't check them individually. I placed the recorder back near the wall, this time making sure to wedge it between 2 boxes. Then I examined every inch of that attic. I found no footprints, no paw prints, no sign that anyone else had been there. My pulse pounded in my temples. I didn't like the feeling at all. I whispered to myself, "There's no one here." But I didn't believe it. I climbed back down and shut the hatch. I found a small padlock with a latch that I'd never used, and I installed it on the attic door. I had to screw in a little hasp and staple set to make it work. It wasn't super sturdy, but it was enough to keep the hatch from casually opening. I locked it and tested it. The door wouldn't budge. Then I went about my day. That night, I tried to ignore every noise. I stayed up with the TV on until past 2 a.m. Just as I was about to doze off, I heard a scraping sound, like wood dragging across wood. It was coming from above my bedroom. It wasn't continuous. It came in short bursts. My heart hammered in my chest. I rolled onto my back and held my breath. I listened for a long time, but eventually it stopped. I told myself the latch was locked. Nothing could get in or out. The next day, I called a friend who's a home inspector. I asked him for advice. He told me sometimes boards shift in older houses. He said rodents can sneak in if there's an opening near the roof. He offered to come by next week. I said sure, but I wished he could come sooner. I felt on edge all morning. Every time I walked under the attic, I tensed up. In the afternoon, I gathered my courage and climbed up again. I unlocked the padlock, lifted the hatch, and peeked inside. It looked normal at first. I shone the flashlight around. The recorder was still near the wall, but it was turned a few inches to one side like someone had nudged it. I looked at the dust on the floor. There were new scuff marks. My breathing got faster. I knelt down and ran my hand over the floorboards. They felt dry and rough. There was no sign of an animal nest. There was no sign of footprints. I saw a few small scratches in the wood near the boxes, but I couldn't tell if they were old or new. I decided to try to record the attic. I had an old phone that still worked, so I used that. I set it to record audio and video, then placed it on a box facing the center of the attic. I made sure the lens could see as much as possible. Then I whispered, "If there's anything here, I want to catch it." My hands were shaking. I climbed down, locked the hatch again, and went about the rest of my day. That evening, I retrieved the phone. I had to unlock the hatch, climb up, grab it, and climb back down. I sat in my living room and played the footage. It was about 5 hours long, so I skipped through sections. For the first hour, nothing happened. The attic was still. Dust motes drifted in the dim light from the flashlight I left up there. In the second hour, I heard a faint scraping noise, but the camera didn't show anything moving. Then I jumped when I saw the cassette recorder shift about an inch on its own. It was subtle, but I could see it move. There was no breeze. There was no vibration. The camera shook a bit, but I think that was me climbing up or down. At the moment the recorder moved, I heard a faint scratching sound in the audio. It didn't sound like a rat or a squirrel. It sounded like a soft, deliberate dragging. My stomach dropped. I felt a tight knot in my throat. I paused the video. I didn't want to watch anymore. I turned off the phone and stared at the attic door above me. It was locked again, but I didn't feel safe. My heart was racing. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That an old tape recorder moved by itself and I have weird audio on a phone? They'd think I was joking or crazy. I was sweating. My hands trembled. That night the noises were louder. I heard tapping, scraping, and a soft thump at one point. It sounded like something shifting a box. I sat in my bed with the lights on, hugging my knees, staring at the ceiling. Every now and then, I said to myself, "Stop. It's just your imagination." But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was up there, messing with me. I kept remembering that hushed voice on the tape. "This is my place. Don't come here." I tried to sleep but failed. At around 3 a.m., I thought I heard a slow drag across the attic floor, like something heavy moving. I felt cold sweats. My heart pounded in my ears. I got up, went to the hallway, and just stared at the locked hatch. I wanted to yell, "Go away!" But I stayed silent. My mouth felt dry. I had trouble swallowing. I went back to bed and turned on my TV to drown out the small sounds. Eventually, I fell asleep with the TV still on. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I went up to the attic in broad daylight. I wore a headlamp this time to keep my hands free. I brought a crowbar, not to pry anything open, but to feel secure. I slowly opened the hatch and climbed inside. My headlamp lit the space. The recorder was still in the same spot, but a couple of my boxes looked shifted. The corner of one box was bent, like someone pressed on it. I walked over to it. I tugged the lid open. The books were still there, but they looked rummaged through. A few were out of order. I felt a surge of anger, like I was being invaded. I stood there, breathing heavily, glaring at the walls and the rafters. There was nowhere for anyone to hide, yet I felt watched. I crouched near the cassette recorder. I picked it up and turned it on. Static greeted me. I tried one tape, then another. Nothing. Then I found the tape I heard before. I played it. I heard the same whisper. "This is my place. Don't come here." It sounded stronger this time, like someone speaking directly into my ear. I dropped the recorder. It clattered to the floor, but the tape kept running. The whisper faded, replaced by static again. I snatched up the recorder, jammed the tape back in the box, and shoved everything into a trash bag. I dragged the bag to the hatch and threw it down the ladder. I wanted it all out of the attic. I carefully checked the corners, but I found nothing else that looked suspicious. I climbed down, sealed the trash bag, and placed it outside on my back patio. I didn't know what else to do with it. The sunlight made me feel a little safer, but I was still tense. I locked the attic hatch again. I tested the lock twice. I went out to the backyard and looked at the trash bag. I felt like I should burn it, but that might cause a bigger problem. So I left it there, away from the house. I stood in the backyard for a long time, thinking about the nights ahead. I didn't hear any noises outside, but I could still imagine the faint tapping coming from above my bedroom. I spent the rest of the day checking the roof, the eaves, every possible opening. I didn't find anything that looked big enough for a person to squeeze through. I patched up a couple of gaps just in case. By nightfall, I was exhausted. I went to bed with every light off, hoping maybe the weird presence would go away if I didn't give it attention. But late at night, I heard something again. It was a single solid tap, like someone knocking once. I felt goosebumps break out on my arms. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. A moment later, there was another tap. It came from the attic. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. Then I heard a faint scraping. I pulled the covers up to my chest and stared at the ceiling. I couldn't see anything, but I sensed something up there. My heart pounded. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. I had locked the hatch, removed the tapes, cleaned up the clutter, and sealed the gaps. Yet it was still there. I stayed awake until dawn, listening for more sounds. They came and went, always soft, always slow, just enough to keep my nerves on edge. I never heard a voice, but I kept remembering the words. "Don't come here." I started thinking maybe I was the intruder, and the attic belonged to something else. The idea made my stomach twist. When the sun rose, I got up and walked around the house, checking for damage. Nothing was out of place. I felt shaky and tired. I decided I needed a break. Maybe I'd stay at a friend's place for a few days or get a motel room. The idea of spending another night with the tapping sounds and the thought of the recorder moving on its own was more than I could handle. I glanced at the ceiling one last time before stepping out the door. I locked the house behind me. As I walked to my car, I heard a single faint thump from inside. It sounded like it came from above the hallway. My heart thudded, and I forced myself to keep going. I started the car, took a deep breath, and drove away. I still get tense when I think about that night. It was late, a little past 11, and I was on a dark stretch of highway. I saw a glow in the distance and realized it was one of those old roadside diners. I needed a break, and I needed some caffeine to keep me going. The sign flickered in and out, and the parking lot was empty except for my beat-up sedan. I didn't see any other cars, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted some coffee. I pulled into a spot right by the entrance. The parking lot was cracked and uneven. My tires crunched on gravel and bits of broken glass. I opened the car door, and the night air felt cold against my face. The yellowish light from inside the diner spilled onto the asphalt, forming a small island of brightness in the otherwise dark surroundings. I noticed my breath in the air. which surprised me because it hadn't felt that cold on the drive. I walked up to the diner's door and saw my own reflection in the glass. My eyes looked tired and my hair was messy from hours on the road. I paused for a second, then pulled the door open. A little bell jingled overhead, but there was no one around to pay attention to it. Inside, the lights hummed quietly, one of them flickering every few seconds. The place smelled like old coffee, frying grease, and something stale I couldn't place. There were a few tables scattered around, all empty. The seats were covered in a cracked red vinyl. A jukebox or some kind of music machine usually catches my eye in places like that. But at first I just saw a small counter and a man standing behind it. He looked to be in his late 40s or maybe early 50s. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and a dingy white apron tied around his waist. He had short, thinning hair and deep lines in his face. His eyes followed me as soon as I stepped in, but he didn't say anything. He gave a small nod. I lifted my hand in a half wave. Then, in the corner, I heard a soft crackle of music. I glanced to the side and noticed an antique-looking record player. It was more like a vintage turntable inside a wooden cabinet. It was playing a song from the 50s. I recognized something about the melody, but the lyrics were fuzzy. It had that echoey, old-fashioned sound. I walked up to the counter and slid onto one of the stools. They squeaked under my weight. The man didn't ask me what I wanted, so I cleared my throat and said, "Can I get a coffee?" He nodded again, turned around, and grabbed a mug from a cupboard. I looked around while he poured it. The diner had a faint buzzing sound, which I realized was coming from a fly zapper in the corner. There were a few flies circling the light, but none of them got zapped. The walls were a dull yellow, maybe from too many years of cigarette smoke. A couple of old posters hung crooked, showing hamburgers and milkshakes. The place felt neglected. The man placed the coffee in front of me. It smelled strong. The steam rose and faded in the air. I could see little specks of coffee grounds swirling on the surface. I picked up the mug, blew on it, and took a sip. It tasted bitter and burned the tip of my tongue. I set the mug down. I felt the need to stretch my back, so I rolled my shoulders and tried to loosen up. I had been in the car for hours and everything felt tight. The music played behind me, soft and crackly. After a moment, I noticed the song ended and started over. It played the same tune. I caught that right away. It was the exact same track, but it sounded slightly sped up, like someone had bumped the pitch control on the record player. The vocals were higher, and the rhythm felt rushed. I glanced over, but I didn't see anyone near the machine. I looked at the man behind the counter. He had his arms resting on the counter, looking at me with a blank expression. I tried to start a little conversation. "That's some old tune you got playing," I said. He shrugged. I waited a second. He didn't reply. I shifted on the stool. My skin prickled on the back of my neck. The place felt too still. The air seemed heavier than normal, and I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above me. I noticed a faint smell of disinfectant or bleach coming from somewhere in the back. I heard a dripping sound, like a faucet that wasn't turned off all the way. The coffee tasted sour now. I swallowed anyway, trying to stay polite. The attendant didn't move. He just kept looking at me, or maybe through me. It was hard to tell. The music looped again. It started from the beginning. Same scratchy introduction, same old-time singing voice. But now the pitch was even higher. The singer sounded squeaky. It was the kind of thing you'd laugh about if the situation felt normal. But it didn't feel normal. My pulse sped up, and a little sweat beaded on my forehead. I took another sip of coffee to give my hands something to do. My heart thumped in my chest, and I told myself to keep calm. The man behind the counter still hadn't moved. He blinked, but that was about it. I decided it was time to leave. I felt a sudden urge to be anywhere else. My body felt tense, and my legs wanted to run. I had that tight feeling in my stomach, like I'd eaten something bad. So I slipped a hand into my pocket and pulled out some cash. I counted out enough for the coffee, which was probably a couple of bucks at most, though I hadn't seen a menu or a price listed. The man slowly reached out his hand and took the money. His fingers were cold when they brushed mine. I tried to hide a shudder. I wasn't sure why he felt so cold. The diner itself wasn't freezing, just a bit chilly from the night air. He set the money in the register without a word. I heard the click and saw the tiny drawer slide back. Then he just stood there again, his arms at his sides. I turned on the stool, ready to leave, and that's when I heard the record player hiss with static. It gave a sharp crackle. The music went silent for a heartbeat. Then it started up again. The voice sounded distorted, like the machine was broken. I could pick out some of the lyrics. They mentioned love and nights under the stars. It was typical romantic stuff from that era. But then I heard my own name. It rang out clear as day in the singer's voice. I froze. My muscles locked up for a second. My scalp tingled and I felt my mouth go dry. That made no sense. Nobody in that diner knew my name, and I'd never heard that version of the song in my life. My name wasn't common enough to appear in random music. It wasn't something like John or Michael. Yet there it was in the lyrics, like it had always been part of the song. I turned around to look at the record player. My breathing went shallow, and I noticed my hands were shaking. The record spun on its platter, the needle following the groove. But the speaker made a faint whining noise before the name came through again. I said, "What the hell?" It was the first thing that came to mind. I felt short of breath. I turned to the man behind the counter, searching for any sign of a prank or trick. Maybe there was a hidden microphone or some digital machine rigged up to the old turntable, but I didn't see any wires or modern equipment. The man just smiled, a slight curling of his lips. It wasn't a friendly grin. It was more like a smirk, like he was amused by my reaction. I felt a rush of anger and fear at the same time. "How do you know my name?" I asked. My voice sounded shaky, even to me. He didn't reply. He just looked at me. The record player's song kept going, and my name popped up again in the verse. I felt a chill race down my arms. I had goosebumps, and my knees felt weak. I took a step toward the door, but something in me wanted an explanation. I opened my mouth again. "Seriously," I said. "What's going on?" The man's smirk grew a little, showing a hint of teeth. He didn't make a sound. The overhead lamp flickered at that moment, making a buzzing noise that cut through the tension. I forced myself to take a breath. I'm not a brave guy. I don't go looking for weird experiences. I just wanted a coffee. Standing there, I felt a sense of dread so strong that my mind almost went blank. My body told me to get out. Every muscle tensed like I was about to run a race. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. My palms were slick with sweat. The record kept playing that old tune. The singer's voice warbled and rose, repeating lines about heartbreak or something like that. But every so often, my name would be there in the middle of a line. It was impossible. That's the only word that came to my head. Impossible. I glanced at the door again. My hand twitched by my side, ready to push it open. But the man behind the counter didn't move to stop me. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, that crooked smile on his face. My chest felt tight. I couldn't stand the silence any longer. The record's hiss and pop felt louder than normal conversation. I heard a car passing on the highway outside, the faint whoosh of tires on asphalt. That small, normal sound pulled me back into reality. I took a breath and said, "I'm leaving." My voice was unsteady, but I tried to keep it firm. The man gave one slow nod. Then he turned his head slightly, as if to glance at the record player. I followed his gaze and saw the needle lift, skip, and drop back onto the beginning of the record again. The static roared, then the music started over. It wasn't sped up this time. It was the correct pitch, but the singer's voice sounded worn, like the track had played one too many times. I heard a faint scratch in the background. I turned back, fully facing the door now. My reflection in the glass showed how pale I looked. My eyes were wide, and sweat clung to my temples. I reached for the handle and pulled. The cool outside air rushed in, carrying the smell of dirt and dried leaves. I stepped out, letting the door swing shut behind me. The bell jingled overhead. For a moment, I stood on the cracked pavement, feeling my body tremble. My legs felt like rubber. My mouth was still dry and my mind reeled. I fumbled in my pocket for my car keys. My hands shook so badly I dropped them. They clanked against the ground. I had to squat down and pick them up. The silence of the night pressed in on me, except for the distant hum of the diner's lights. I thought I could still hear the record playing inside. It might have been my imagination. I tried not to dwell on it. I opened the car door, slid behind the wheel, and slammed the door shut. I locked it out of instinct, though I didn't see anyone chasing me or anything like that. I started the engine, gripping the steering wheel. My knuckles were white. I didn't bother to check my mirrors. I just shifted into drive and pulled out onto the highway. The back tires skidded on loose gravel for a second before catching on the asphalt. As I accelerated, I kept glancing at the diner's lights in the rearview mirror. It got smaller and smaller until it was gone. My chest heaved as I tried to calm down. I wiped sweat from my forehead with my sleeve. Everything felt surreal. But I knew it had happened. I couldn't rationalize it. My phone was on the passenger seat. For a split second, I considered calling someone, maybe a friend, maybe the police. But then I pictured trying to explain it. I had no idea what I'd even say. The record player said my name. That sounded insane. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt like sandpaper. My heartbeat pounded in my chest for miles down the road. I kept the radio off. I needed silence to gather my thoughts. The hum of the engine was enough. I drove until I reached the next town, which took maybe 30 or 40 minutes. I found a motel, parked outside the office, and just sat there, breathing. I finally looked at my face in the rearview mirror. I looked exhausted. My skin was clammy, and my eyes darted around. I felt like I was waiting for someone to tap on my window or something. But the parking lot was quiet. A single street light cast a hazy glow over a few parked cars. Nobody was around. Eventually, I checked into a room with a few words to the night clerk. I paid in cash, asked no questions, and he didn't comment on my state. I guess he'd seen all kinds of travelers come through. In the room, I locked the door, slid the chain across, and stood there with my forehead against the wood. My ears still rang with that weird old melody. My name echoed in my head. I rubbed my face and forced myself to take slow, deep breaths. The room smelled like stale carpet. The bed was covered with a thin blanket. I sat down on it and stared at the wall for a while. I didn't sleep much that night. To this day, I can't explain it. I keep telling myself there must have been some logical explanation, maybe a trick record or a coincidence. But I can't shake the feeling I had in that diner. The way that man smiled at me, the way the pitch changed, and the impossible sound of my name in that old song still makes my skin crawl. Whenever I think about it, I remember the smell of stale coffee and the hum of those lights. My chest tightens and I feel a jolt in my gut. I never went back there. I couldn't even remember the diner's name the next day. The memory of the sign is hazy, like it was half burned out. I tried to find it on a map once, but I didn't see anything that matched. That might be my own fault. I was so focused on getting away that I didn't check the details. But the experience was real. I can still taste that bitter coffee if I think about it too long. Sometimes on a late drive, I glance at every diner I pass, just to make sure I never stop at the wrong place. I can't forget that high-pitched record or the scratchy way my name came through the speakers. When it pops into my mind, my heart races. That's the truth of it. I'm not a superstitious guy, but I know what I heard. That's all I can say. I'm telling you this because you asked if I've ever had a strange experience on the road. Well, that's it. It still makes my hands shake a bit to think about, but that's the story. A late-night diner, a silent attendant, and a record player that somehow knew my name. I have no proof, but I remember every detail. And I guess that's enough for me to keep driving past diners that look too old or too empty after dark. I don't want another night like that again. Ever. I never expected an empty building to make me so uneasy. That morning, I walked into that apart hotel project with a simple goal: check the basic infrastructure. I had my clipboard, my phone, and my camera. I was alone, and I'd done this kind of inspection dozens of times before. The place was massive: 10 floors, lots of corridors, and units that were supposed to be furnished at some point. But the project never got finished. Everything was bare: no beds, no chairs, no signs of life. I remember thinking it was a routine assignment. It wasn't. I arrived around 9 in the morning. The main entrance was simple: 2 large glass doors and a small lobby space. There was dust everywhere. The reception desk sat in the middle, covered in plastic sheets that were half torn off. I glanced around for a light switch. It didn't work. I shone my phone's flashlight on the walls. The wiring was incomplete in many areas, so I wasn't surprised. I just jotted down a few notes about the electrical issues. My plan was to walk floor by floor, take photos, note any major structural problems, and then go home. I started on the ground floor. I checked the lobby and the hallways. The walls were solid. The floors had tiles, though many were cracked or missing. A few spots looked like someone had tried to pry tiles off with a crowbar. I moved on to the staff room behind the reception area. It had old paint cans, a few tools scattered around, and a strong smell of musty air. I opened a small closet. It had wires, empty boxes, and a couple of yellowed manuals that described how the electrical system was supposed to be installed. I left everything as it was. Next, I headed to the second floor. I walked up the wide concrete stairs because the elevator wasn't functional at all. As soon as I stepped onto the second floor, I noticed the echo of my footsteps. The place was huge, with a long hallway and about 20 rooms. I could see each door all closed. Some had numbers already mounted, some didn't. The windows at the end of the corridor let in a bit of light, but it was still dim. I took pictures of the walls, the ceiling, some chipped paint, and more missing tiles. I felt fine at that point, just focused on the job. I spent about an hour on the second floor. I opened a few room doors to check inside. They were empty. Nothing but bare walls, unfinished bathrooms, and a layer of dust on the concrete floors. Some rooms had small piles of rubble or wooden planks. I wrote down everything that needed attention. My plan was to show my boss that we might need a significant budget to get this place operational, or maybe we'd tear it down and build something else. Either way, I was just doing my part. Around noon, I took a quick break in the lobby, snacked on a granola bar, and drank from a water bottle I'd brought. The place was silent. I didn't see or hear anyone else. Sometimes, in older structures, I run into squatters or security guards, but not here. This building was locked down from the outside. The front gate was rusted shut, and I had the only key to the padlock. After my snack, I headed up to the third floor. The third floor looked a lot like the second. Same long corridor, same dust, same missing tiles. I moved from room to room, taking photos, checking if any walls had cracks that indicated structural issues. Everything seemed stable enough, just neglected. By the time I finished the third floor, it was close to 2 p.m. I still had several floors to go, and I considered picking up the pace. I moved on to floors 4, 5, and 6 without much trouble. I wrote the same observations: incomplete plumbing, missing fixtures, and some holes in the walls. The day dragged on, but I was used to this kind of work. My phone's battery dropped a bit from using the flashlight in dark corridors, so I shut it off whenever I could. I was counting on finishing before sunset. I reached the 7th floor around 4 p.m. That's when I felt the first hint of something off. I heard a faint sound from one of the rooms. It sounded like a door closing or maybe a piece of wood shifting. I stopped in the hallway and listened. My heart rate picked up a little, but I told myself it was just the old building settling. Old structures sometimes make random noises, especially with changes in temperature. So I moved on. I checked each room, looked at the bathrooms, noted the chipped edges near the door frames, and made sure there were no water leaks. But the noise lingered in my mind. It sounded too controlled to be random. When I finished the 7th floor, it was almost 5 p.m. The sun was starting to dip, and the corridors looked darker. I was getting tired. My throat felt dry, and my legs felt stiff from walking around so much. I still had the 8th, ninth, and 10th floors left, plus the rooftop area. I decided to push through quickly. I took shorter notes and fewer photos. If something major was wrong, it would be obvious. Minor details could wait for a second visit. By the time I reached the 10th floor, it was close to 6:30 p.m. The sun was low, and the place had a cold feel to it. The temperature outside dropped, and there was no insulation in the building. I glanced around the 10th floor. It looked basically the same as the others. I took a quick pass, then went up a small staircase to the rooftop. There, I walked around the water tanks and made sure they were intact. I saw a few cracks in the concrete near the edges of the roof. I took pictures and quickly made a note. Then I decided I'd done enough for the day. I started heading back down. The stairwell was dim, so I turned on my phone's flashlight again. I walked from the 10th floor down to the 8th, skipping the 9th for the moment. I planned to double-check something on the 8th that I'd jotted down. It was a cracked support beam cover near the elevator shaft. I wanted one last photo because I wasn't sure if my earlier shot was clear. So I stepped out of the stairwell onto the 8th floor, took the picture, and then got back into the stairwell. That's when I realized how dark it had become. I also felt a chill, like a gust of cold air moving through the building. I made my way down to the 3rd floor. I noticed how quiet it was. No traffic noise, no birds, nothing. I turned at the landing and walked into the corridor, aiming to take a quick final shot of the hallway. My phone's battery was at about 15%, but I wanted a couple of pictures of the 3rd floor corridor for reference. I took a few steps and raised my phone. I snapped 2 or 3 photos of the hallway. As I did, I saw something unusual. The door to room 305 was ajar. I was sure I'd left it closed. In fact, I remembered checking that room hours earlier. It had been locked. I'm thorough about these things, and I distinctly remember jiggling the handle and finding it locked. I felt a surge of adrenaline. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the sound of my own breathing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the latch was loose or the door was never fully shut. But it didn't feel right. The gap looked too wide, as if someone had pushed the door open. The corridor felt colder at that spot, like a draft was passing through. I walked slowly toward room 305. Each step felt heavier. I shone my flashlight on the door. The number plate was hanging on by one screw, tilted. The door was cracked open about an inch. I took a breath and pushed it open. Right away, I felt a burst of cold air on my face, stronger than anywhere else in the building. It made my eyes water a bit. I stepped inside. It was dark. The windows were covered with plywood on the outside, so no light came in. That's when I heard a sharp click, like someone flipping a light switch. The light didn't come on, obviously, because there was no electricity in the building, but the sound was unmistakable. My heart jumped. I swung my phone's flashlight around the room. There was nothing but the bare concrete walls and a small bathroom door off to the side. The switch on the wall was near the entrance, but I was nowhere near it. I couldn't see any sign of someone else inside. Everything was still except for that cold wind swirling near my legs. I stepped deeper into the room. My shoes crunched on the dust. I moved the light beam across the floor. Then I saw footprints in the dust, fresh ones. They formed a short trail near the wall, circled around the center of the room, and then led back to the door. They weren't mine. I had just stepped in, and these prints looked older in shape, like they'd been made earlier but still more recent than the thick layer of dust in other parts of the floor. My skin prickled. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead, and my mouth went dry. I glanced around, shining the light on every corner, trying to see if anyone was hiding. It was empty. I didn't want to stay there a second longer. I turned around, took one more look at the switch on the wall, then moved toward the door. I stepped out into the corridor, feeling relieved to be back in the faint glow from my phone. Then I pulled the door shut behind me. I heard a metallic clunk from inside the door, like a lock sliding into place. I tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside again. I felt a wave of panic. I didn't try to force it, though. I just wanted to leave. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I started walking quickly down the corridor toward the stairwell. My shoes scuffed the dusty tiles and my breathing got shallow. My heart was still racing. I kept looking over my shoulder, worried I'd see that door open again or hear another click. But all I heard was my own footsteps. I reached the stairwell, swung the door open, and practically jogged down the steps to the lobby. My chest felt tight and my palms were sweaty. I checked my phone. The battery was down to 10%. I considered calling someone, but I realized I had no reason to. Nothing had actually happened aside from that weird click and the footprints. Still, I felt uneasy. When I got to the lobby, I walked straight to the exit. I unlatched the padlock, pushed open the heavy metal gate, and stepped out into the fresh evening air. The sky was dark blue, and the streetlights were flickering on. I felt like I could breathe again. I locked the gate behind me, even though I questioned why I was bothering. There was no one else supposed to be inside. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But those footprints said otherwise, and that door, locking itself from the inside, made no sense. I got in my car and just sat there for a moment staring at the building. From the outside, it looked harmless. It was tall, with rows of windows that were mostly boarded up. A few windows were open, letting in the night air. I wondered if something or someone was in there with me, but I had no proof, just my gut feeling and those footprints in the dust. My hands were shaking. I started the car, turned on the headlights, and pulled away. On the drive home, I kept thinking about that click. I'd heard light switches click 1,000 times. This was the same sound, but it happened in a dark room when I was alone, right after I felt that cold draft. I tried to recall if there was any chance I'd brushed against the switch or bumped it, but I stood at least 2 feet from the wall. Also, the footprints were definitely not mine. They were in a different pattern, almost like someone paced around. My footprints were only by the entrance and near the spot where I shined my light. Those other prints were older, but still fresh enough to show detail. I spent a restless night. I had a hard time falling asleep. My thoughts raced, replaying that moment in room 305. I felt stupid for being this shaken by an empty room, but it didn't feel empty. The next day, I reported my findings at the office. I gave a summary of all the floors, the condition of the structure, and the big repairs needed. I left out the part about the door, the footprints, and the cold air. I just said I needed a team with me if I was going back there, since the place was large and in a rough state. My boss agreed to send 2 more inspectors with me next time. I haven't returned alone since. The memory of that door still bothers me. I keep picturing the moment it locked itself from inside. I can't explain it. Doors don't just lock on their own, especially when there's no key and the latch was on the inside. But that's exactly what happened. Those footprints proved someone had been in there, or maybe still was. I don't know. I try not to think about it too much. We plan to do a thorough walkthrough again soon, but I made it clear I won't be the first to open room 305. In the grand scheme of things, it might be a small event. But for me, it was unsettling. This wasn't a dark story of tragedies or anything like that. It was just one of those moments where something feels wrong and you can't rationalize it. I felt a fear that I couldn't shake off, and my body reacted with sweat, a pounding heart, and shaky hands. I still remember that rush of cold air on my face, the echo of my footsteps in the dust, and that quiet click of the switch. It's all burned into my mind. Since then, I've told a few colleagues about it. They shrug and say maybe it was a draft or a loose mechanism. But that doesn't explain the footprints or the way that door locked from inside. I'm not sure what does, and I'm not eager to find out on my own. I'm scheduled to visit the apart hotel again next week with 2 other people. This time we'll have better flashlights and maybe some portable work lights. We'll check everything together and no one will wander off alone. If we see that door open again, at least there'll be witnesses. But I don't plan to be the one standing in front. I already had my close call. I might be able to shrug off weird sounds or a draft, but a locked door with footprints inside is too much for me. I'll do my job, but I won't let myself get cornered like that again. That's the promise I made to myself after walking out of that building, and I intend to keep it. I rented that old two-story wooden house last fall because I needed a quiet place to work. I was tired of the city noises. I wanted some distance from traffic, crowded streets, and the constant movement of people. The ad for this house promised isolation and plenty of space. It sat on a large piece of land several miles from the nearest town. The idea sounded perfect at first. I could wake up early, do my work, and take breaks in the yard without hearing any sirens or neighbors. That was all I wanted, and I jumped on it. From the outside, the place looked a bit worn. The paint was chipping off in several spots, and some boards on the porch creaked when I stepped on them the first time. I noticed a few windows were older models, with single panes that rattled when a breeze passed. The landlord told me it had been built in the 1950s. It had changed owners a few times. He claimed it was structurally sound. I believed him because I needed it right away, and it still stood upright despite its age. Inside, the layout was simple. The living room connected to a small kitchen, and there was a staircase leading to 2 bedrooms upstairs. One bedroom had a long window facing a small wooded area behind the house. The other bedroom overlooked the gravel driveway and a few scraggly bushes. The living room window faced the porch. During the day, everything felt normal. Sunlight came in through the windows, lighting up the wooden floors and some leftover furniture the landlord had left behind. There was a worn-out couch in the living room, a small dining table near the kitchen, and a bed frame upstairs in the main bedroom. I brought my own mattress, blankets, and my work setup. I placed my desk near one of the windows downstairs so I could glance outside while working. I spent the first few days moving things around. I worked on a few projects, answered emails, and took phone calls without any distractions. The quiet was exactly what I wanted, but I started noticing something odd after sunset. The interior lights reflected against the old windows. The glass produced a faint mirror effect if I looked for too long. On the first night, I thought I saw a shape behind me when I passed near the living room window. It was just a glimpse. It looked like a tall form, right in the background of my reflection. I turned around and there was nothing there. The living room was empty. The hallway leading to the kitchen was dark, but I could see the outline of the refrigerator. There was nobody else in the house. I felt my pulse quicken for a second, but I told myself it was only a trick of light. I went upstairs that night and tried to sleep. The old wood in the walls and floors seemed to settle throughout the evening. I heard soft creaks and pops. There was a draft that made the windows rattle a bit. I felt annoyed by the constant noises. I wasn't scared, just slightly on edge. I told myself that old houses make sounds. That's the way it is. I ended up falling asleep around midnight. Over the next couple of days, I stayed busy with work. I did video conferences, wrote reports, and took care of my usual tasks. During daylight, the house felt normal. The floors still creaked, but that just felt like part of the house's character. I actually appreciated the calm. When the sun set, I tried not to wander around too much. I would just go to the kitchen, grab a quick meal, and bring it to my desk or straight to the couch. I noticed that whenever I passed the windows at night, I got an uneasy feeling. The reflection was clearer in the dark interior with the lights on. It always seemed like something could appear behind me at any moment. One evening, I finally decided to check the reflection more carefully. I was standing in front of the living room window, finishing up a phone call. I pressed the end call button and looked toward the glass. My own reflection was there, but behind me I saw a distinct figure. It looked like a tall man wearing dark clothes. He wasn't moving. He just stood behind me a few feet away near the edge of the couch. My heart pounded, and I felt a wave of panic rise up in my chest. I spun around so fast that my phone slipped out of my hand. I saw nothing. The couch was there, the floor lamp was there, but no one was standing near them. I held my breath and listened. There was complete silence except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. My hands shook a little. I told myself it must have been a weird reflection or a shadow. I picked up my phone, checked around the living room, then the hallway, then the stairs. I even opened the front door and looked outside with a flashlight. No one was there. The yard was empty. The closest neighbor was about half a mile away, and I saw no signs of any intruders. I told myself to calm down and went back inside. I couldn't concentrate on any more work that night. I turned off my computer, locked the front door, and headed upstairs. I felt a little embarrassed for freaking out. I tried to breathe slowly. My chest felt tight, and my face was warm from the rush of adrenaline. I brushed my teeth in the small bathroom upstairs and got into bed. The house was dark and quiet, but my mind was restless. I kept thinking about that reflection. It hadn't just been a blurry shape. I'd seen details. A man, tall, wearing something like a dark coat or jacket. I tossed and turned, but eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I walked downstairs and noticed that the heavy curtain on the living room window was pulled halfway open. I had closed it the night before because I didn't want to see any reflections. I was sure I'd drawn the curtains completely, yet now it was open enough to let in sunlight. I looked around to see if maybe I'd left a window open that caused a draft, but the window was shut tight. There was no breeze that could have moved that curtain. It was too heavy to move on its own anyway. I stood there for a moment, feeling a prickling sensation on my skin. Then I pulled the curtain shut again. I tried to forget it and focus on my routine. I made coffee, checked my emails, and got on a video call. The day passed without any strange incidents. But that night, I repeated my usual pattern. I finished my dinner, cleaned up in the kitchen, and went to close the curtains. I wanted the living room window fully covered so I wouldn't catch any glimpse of that reflection again. I even checked that the curtain rod was stable. I tucked the bottom edges of the curtain into the sides so it wouldn't sway in case of a slight draft. Then I turned off the downstairs lights and went upstairs with a small lamp to guide my way. I slept a bit better, but I still woke up feeling tense. When I went downstairs in the morning, I found the curtain pulled open again. This time it was about a quarter of the way open. The gap was narrow, but it definitely wasn't closed all the way. I swallowed hard and approached the window. The rod was still intact and the sides of the curtain were still tucked in, except for the middle part that had been slid to one side. My heartbeat sped up again. I tried to think of a simple explanation. Maybe the fabric was slipping on the rod. Maybe I was messing up my own memory. But deep down I knew I had closed it carefully. Over the next few days, the same thing happened every morning. I would go downstairs, and the curtain would be at least partially open. I started feeling uneasy in my own space. Working there alone at night became a chore. I began turning off my computer earlier. I left the downstairs lights off most of the evening so I wouldn't see any reflections by accident. I ate quick meals and then hurried upstairs. I felt silly for behaving that way, but I couldn't help it. One night I decided to stay up and see if anything happened. I made coffee around 10 p.m. and sat on the couch facing the curtain. I wanted to see if the curtain would move on its own. I kept a dim lamp on the side table so the room wouldn't be completely dark, but it wasn't bright enough to create a strong reflection. I sat there for an hour, maybe two, just checking my phone and glancing at the curtain every few minutes. Nothing happened. The curtain stayed in place. I felt my eyes getting heavy. Eventually, I went upstairs, feeling frustrated. I left the curtain closed and I stayed awake in bed for a while, listening for any movement downstairs. I heard the usual creaks, but nothing that sounded like footsteps. The next morning I came down, and the curtain was open again. This time, it was pulled a good foot from the edge. It wasn't subtle. I stood there, staring at the bright rectangle of glass. It felt like someone was messing with me. My legs felt tense, and my mouth went dry. I got a sudden urge to check every inch of the house. I looked inside closets under the stairs and even in the crawl space behind the kitchen. I found dust, old boxes, and a broken chair, but no signs of anyone hiding. I climbed up to the attic with a flashlight. It was mostly empty except for a few cobwebs and insulation. I didn't see any footprints in the dust. I was alone. That discovery didn't make me feel better. I kept thinking about the reflection I had seen. I remembered the shape of that man, his height, the way he stood so still. It felt different from random illusions. I started double-locking the front door each night, and I added a simple security bar to the back door, which led out to a small deck. I stacked a few boxes in front of the living room window to see if that helped hold the curtain in place. But the following morning, the boxes were shifted a bit, and the curtain was open again. The boxes weren't knocked over. They were just moved an inch or so, as if someone had nudged them out of the way. I decided I needed to do more than just sit and wait. I went to the local hardware store and bought a cheap motion sensor. It was the kind that lets out a chime if something moves in front of it. I placed it near the living room window, pointing at the curtain. I tested it by walking in front of it, and the chime sounded. That night, I made sure it was armed. I closed the curtain, blocked it with the boxes, and went upstairs. I waited in bed, feeling restless. I kept my ears open for that chime. I imagined it going off in the middle of the night. I pictured myself rushing downstairs and finding someone, but the house stayed silent. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, it was already light outside. I sat up fast, pulled on a pair of sweatpants, and hurried downstairs. The curtain was open again about the same amount as before, but the motion sensor was still on. It hadn't triggered. I walked over to it, waved my hand in front of it, and it beeped loudly. It worked fine. I felt a chill go through me. That meant someone, or something, had opened that curtain without setting off the sensor. I felt my stomach turn and my hands got sweaty. I pulled the curtain shut again, then looked at the sensor. It was pointing in the right direction. The battery was fresh, yet it hadn't gone off all night. I had no explanation. I moved through the house looking for any sign that a window or door was tampered with. Everything looked normal. I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. The idea that someone was in the house with me seemed impossible, but that was the only thing that made sense. The reflection, the open curtain, the moved boxes, it all pointed to an intruder. But I couldn't find anyone. I began skipping nights there. I started driving into town after dark and staying at a cheap motel, returning early in the morning to handle my work. I told myself it was just until I could figure out what was going on. But even in broad daylight, when I went back, I kept checking my surroundings. I felt twitchy. The floor still creaked, and sometimes I heard soft clicks in the walls as if the wood was shifting. Every time I passed the living room, I looked at that window. The curtain would be exactly how I'd left it unless it was the next morning. Then it was always open. One afternoon, I walked around the property, looking for footprints near the windows. The ground was mostly dry dirt and patchy grass. I found no clear tracks. I peered in through the windows from outside. The living room was empty. I tried to see if there was some reflection trick going on. Nothing stood out. By that point, I had spent almost a month in the house, and the tension never went away. I thought about finding a new place, but I had paid for a few months up front, and I needed that quiet space for my remote job. Or at least, that was my excuse. I never told many people about this. A couple of friends asked how the house was, and I only said it was fine, but a little creepy at night. I didn't want anyone to think I was losing it. I kept waiting for a reasonable explanation. Maybe the house was settling in a strange way. Maybe something about the old window frame caused the curtain to shift. Maybe a minor breeze sneaked in. But that didn't explain the figure I saw in the reflection. It didn't explain how the boxes had been moved or why the motion sensor never went off. One night I returned from the motel and decided to stand in the living room with all the lights off. I turned off my phone so no small screen would light up the place. I stood there in total darkness facing the window. I waited for my eyes to adjust. The only light was a faint glow from the moon outside. After a while, I could see the outlines of furniture. My breathing felt loud in the quiet. I waited, trying to sense any movement around me. For a moment, I thought I saw a slight shift in the darkness near the couch. I squinted. It was just a shadow, or it might have been my eyes playing tricks. But my skin prickled, and I took a step back. I felt something like an electric charge in the air. My scalp felt tight. Then I backed out of the living room and went upstairs. I didn't try that again. For the rest of my stay, I kept the curtains closed and tried not to spend much time downstairs after dark. Every morning I found that one curtain open, and I would close it again without looking too closely. I stopped trying to fight it. I stopped using the motion sensor. I just forced myself to ignore it. I stayed until my contract ended, and then I left without saying much to the landlord. I still think about that reflection sometimes. It felt too real. I can't forget how tall that figure looked behind me, and how still he stood. I think about the curtain, the boxes that shifted, and the motion sensor that never went off. I can't explain it. Nothing was stolen, and I was never physically harmed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never alone at night in that house. Even now, recalling those mornings when I'd walk downstairs and see that heavy curtain pulled open, I feel a knot in my stomach. It's been a while since I left, but the memory is still fresh. When people ask about my time in that country house, I tell them it was quiet and good for work, but I never mention the man in dark clothes behind me. I don't want to see the look on their faces when I describe him. And I don't want to think too much about what or who was watching me from inside that window. I still remember the night I realized something was off about that place. I was sitting in my booth on the second basement level of the parking garage. I'd been there for a couple of months, working the night shift. Most of my shifts were quiet, and I usually spent the early hours making rounds, watching the monitors, and staying awake by scrolling through my phone. But one night, things changed. I was staring at the row of security cameras. The screens were small and had a slight static. The lighting in the third basement was minimal after midnight. The management cut the lights to half power to save electricity. On one of the monitors, I saw movement near a series of concrete columns. It looked like a person walking from one column to the next, but the lighting was too dim to make out details. For a moment, I thought it might be a glitch or a shadow from a passing car on the ramp above. But there weren't any cars moving at that hour. I felt a chill run down my arms. My heartbeat sped up. I leaned forward and squinted at the monitor. The figure moved slowly, and it seemed to pause behind a column. I couldn't see any features or clothing. It was just a dark outline. I tried adjusting the camera angle with the remote controls, but the camera was old and the angle was fixed. I let out a slow breath. My first thought was that someone might be trespassing or hiding out down there. Some people tried to do that, usually homeless individuals looking for a quiet spot. I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of my booth. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed. I could hear the hum of the ventilation system and a faint dripping sound in the distance. As I made my way toward the ramp that led down to the third basement, I noticed how empty and echoey everything felt. My footsteps on the concrete were loud. The air smelled stale, with a hint of car exhaust that always lingered. When I reached the third basement, I turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the dim light, revealing rows of pillars and parked cars. Most of the cars belonged to store employees who left their vehicles overnight, or to people who'd parked and left them for days. I moved between the columns, checking each aisle. My eyes kept darting to the corners, expecting to see someone pop out or run off. Nothing. Just cars and silent concrete. I walked deeper into the level, careful to keep my flashlight moving. At one point, I stopped and listened. I heard a faint scuffling sound like shoes dragging on the ground. It was far away, maybe near the far corner. I called out, "Hey, security, is anyone there?" My voice echoed, and the echo died down. No answer. I waited, heart pounding. I didn't hear anything else. After a few seconds, I continued my search. The scuffling sound didn't repeat. As I turned a corner between two rows of parked cars, I felt a weird tingle at the back of my neck. My hands tightened around the flashlight. The hair on my arms stood up. I scanned the area carefully, shining the light around. I saw nothing. Just more silent cars and concrete walls. I told myself to stay calm. I had a job to do. If someone was there, they might be hiding behind a car or pillar. I checked underneath a few trucks, walked around some SUVs, and still found no one. The smell of rubber and oil was stronger in that corner of the garage. The lights above me flickered slightly. The silence made my own breathing sound too loud. I tapped my flashlight against my thigh a few times, trying to settle my nerves. After a few minutes, I decided I might have spooked myself. It could have been a trick of the light or a reflection from the camera lens. I felt a bit uneasy, but I had no proof anyone was down there. I made my way back to the elevator. There was a service elevator that employees used to move supplies and trash up to the loading dock. It was old and slow, but it saved me a long walk back to the second basement. I pressed the call button, waited for the doors to open, and stepped inside. The metal walls smelled like cleaning products and old steel. The flickering fluorescent tube above my head gave the interior a sickly glow. I pressed the button for the second basement. The door slid shut and the elevator started humming. I crossed my arms, watching the floor indicator. Something felt off. The elevator slowed down. The door opened, onto the third basement. I blinked, confused. The panel said B2 was lit, but we were definitely still on the third basement, or so it seemed. I stepped forward and looked at the sign on the wall. It read, B3. My stomach sank. I pressed the button for the second basement again. The doors closed and the elevator started moving up. But the movement was shaky. I clutched the handrail. The overhead light flickered. The elevator suddenly descended instead of ascending. I felt the drop and heard the faint screech of gears. The door opened on the last basement again. At this point, I felt my throat tighten. I didn't see anyone in front of me. The hallway outside the elevator was dark. It was the same area where I had just been walking around. I looked at the indicator inside the elevator. The lights for the floors flickered from B2 to B3, back and forth like something was pressing the buttons. But I was alone. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand trembled. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed off the elevator walls. No answer. The elevator door started to close, then stopped halfway. It opened again, like someone was blocking the sensor, but I couldn't see anyone. Finally, I pressed the button for the second basement again, hard this time. The door closed all the way, and I felt the elevator lurch upward. It moved slowly. The overhead light stabilized, and the indicator showed B2 approaching. When the door opened, I rushed out and stood in the hallway outside my booth. I felt my heart pounding. My uniform was damp under my arms. I looked back at the elevator, and the door was already sliding shut behind me. The indicator above the elevator flickered again, but then it stayed on B2. I walked quickly to my booth and locked the door from the inside. I checked the monitors. All the screens showed the same static-laced images. I cycled through each camera view of the third basement. No sign of movement, no dark figure, no footprints or shadows, just a few parked cars and the rows of pillars. I turned up the volume on that camera's audio feed. Usually, I could hear faint noises. That night, I heard nothing but static. I tried to calm myself by going through a typical routine. I wrote an incident report in the log, noting I thought I saw a trespasser and that the elevator had some malfunction. I wrote down the time and the details. My handwriting was shaky. I kept thinking about that elevator. I was sure it had gone back down on its own. I told myself it was probably a glitch in the panel or a sensor error. Maintenance workers had complained about the wiring in that elevator for months, but the way the indicators flickered felt wrong. It felt like someone was messing with the buttons from inside. I spent the next hour watching the cameras closely. I didn't see anything unusual. My shift was only halfway over, but I felt drained. The stillness in the parking garage felt heavy. Every time I heard the faint hum of the ventilation or a distant clang of metal, I jumped. I tried to keep my focus, scanning each camera slowly, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing happened for the rest of that hour. At around 3 a.m., I did another patrol. I considered avoiding the third basement, but my job was to cover all levels. As I walked the ramp down to B3, I could feel my pulse in my neck. I tried to breathe steadily. The corridor smelled musty, and water dripped from a pipe overhead. A slow, steady plink of water droplets echoed across the concrete. I checked every row of cars again. I didn't see or hear anything. The area felt cold and the temperature seemed lower than usual, though maybe that was my nerves. I peered behind each pillar, making sure no one was hiding. My footsteps echoed with each step. Sometimes my footstep would echo back in a second delay and I'd freeze, thinking I heard another set of steps. But it was just my own noise bouncing around. After 15 minutes of searching, I headed back to the elevator. This time I hesitated. I looked at the elevator doors, half expecting them to open on their own. I pressed the call button and waited. The door opened and the cabin was empty. It seemed normal. The overhead light flickered a bit, but that was typical. I stepped inside, bracing myself. The metal floor squeaked. I pressed the button for B2. The door closed, and the elevator rose smoothly this time. The indicator switched from B3 to B2 without any problems. The door opened on the second basement, and I stepped out relieved. I shook off the tension and went back to my booth. For the rest of the shift, I sat there watching the monitors, tapping my foot. I tried to stay alert, but my mind kept going back to that weird moment when the elevator traveled down on its own. When my shift ended at 6 a.m., I waited for the next guard to arrive. I told him about the possible trespasser, and I reported the elevator issue. He shrugged and said maintenance would handle it. He'd never noticed anything like that, but he admitted the elevator was old and finicky. I went home trying to sleep off the tension. The next night, I returned and spent most of my shift waiting for something similar to happen. It never did. Days turned into weeks and I didn't see that figure again. The elevator acted normal, except for the occasional flicker of the lights. I asked the building manager if anyone else had reported strange sightings, and he said no. He suggested that maybe I was tired and seeing shadows. I knew what I saw, but I didn't argue. One night I decided to check the old maintenance logs for the elevator. I found nothing that explained the flickering floor indicators. The only repeated complaint was that sometimes the doors didn't close properly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. I tried to explain it to a coworker, but I got the same response. Old building, old wiring, and unreliable equipment. Still, I remembered the footsteps and the movement on the camera. I replayed the footage from that night. The recording quality wasn't great, and the area was dark. The figure's movement was slight. 1 second, a dark shape near a pillar. The next second, it was gone. The rest of the video was static-filled darkness. I couldn't prove anything to anyone. I eventually stopped talking about it. Nobody believed me anyway. A few more months passed and I stayed in that job. I needed the money. I got used to ignoring the strange feelings I sometimes had in that basement. There were nights when I'd be on patrol, and I'd swear I heard distant footsteps, but I never found anyone. I once found fresh footprints in a dusty corner, but I had no idea whose they were. They led to a locked storage room, and there was no sign of a break-in. The elevator had a few more glitches during my time there. It would stop on random floors or the doors would open when no one pressed the button. Each time it happened, I'd feel that rush of adrenaline, but I'd see nothing out of the ordinary. Sometimes I'd ride it and stare at the control panel, waiting for it to move on its own. It never did when I was looking. Eventually, I left that job for something else. I didn't tell my new employer about the weird nights or my suspicions. It felt like something I just had to move on from, but I never forgot about it. Every time I pass that shopping center now, I think about those quiet, dark hours underground. I can still picture the empty rows of cars and the pale overhead lights flickering on that cold concrete floor. I can still hear the hum of the ventilation and the faint dripping of water. I didn't witness any major disasters or crimes there. Nobody died. No children wandered through. There were no dramatic confrontations. It was just that single strange encounter and the odd behavior of that ancient elevator. The memory sticks with me because I can't explain it. Maybe it was a combination of fatigue, shadows, and bad wiring. Or maybe there was someone or something down in that third basement who wanted to make its presence known. I try not to dwell on it too much. Even now I feel my heart rate climb when I think about it. The coldness in the elevator, the flickering lights, and the sense that I wasn't alone. People might say I was being paranoid, and maybe they're right. But on that night, it felt real. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. That's the story. That's what happened. And no matter how many times I tell it or write it down, it still leaves me uneasy when I think about being inside an empty elevator, wondering who or what might be pressing the buttons from the other side. I still remember the night I got lost on that winding mountain road. I was looking for a hotel near the area where I had a business meeting the next morning. The GPS kept cutting out, and the cell phone reception was unreliable. I finally spotted a sign that pointed to a place called Mountain Crest Hotel. It was getting late, and I didn't want to wander around in the dark. I decided to follow the sign and hope for the best. I had no idea what I was walking into. I parked in a small gravel lot. The hotel building stood on a steep hillside surrounded by pines and thick brush. A single dim light hung over the lobby door. The outside walls looked clean enough, and there were a few small windows lit from within. I grabbed my suitcase and walked in. The lobby was neat with a front desk and a few chairs. An old clock on the wall said it was about 8:30 p.m. The receptionist, a middle-aged guy with thick-rimmed glasses, gave me a key and told me I was in room 304 on the third floor. He said the kitchen was closed, but there was a small snack bar in the lobby. I thanked him, used the old elevator, and found my room. Inside, the room looked ordinary. There was a large bed, a little desk, a soft chair, and a TV. The window faced the dark slope of the mountain. I saw a faint outline of treetops, but not much else. I took off my shoes, changed into something comfortable, and tossed my jacket on the chair. The place was quiet, so quiet that I heard every small noise. The walls seemed thick, but I could hear a low hum. I assumed it was the heating system. I sat down on the bed and checked my phone. Barely one bar of service, so no stable internet. I decided to review some work notes and get some rest. I woke up the next morning feeling fine. I showered, got dressed in a suit, and headed downstairs for a quick bite before leaving for my meeting. In daylight, the lobby looked brighter, but still a bit stale. The same receptionist was there. He pointed me toward a small room where they served coffee and pastries. I had a plain muffin and a black coffee. Then I drove off to my meeting in a nearby town. Everything went smoothly, and by 4 p.m. I was back on the road. I thought about heading home, but the drive was long and the day had worn me out. I figured I'd spend one more night at the hotel and leave early the next day. When I returned, it was around 5 p.m. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The pines around the building looked taller and darker. I grabbed a soda from the lobby vending machine and got back in the elevator. As I reached the third floor, the air felt different, heavier somehow. I didn't see anyone else in the hallway. The carpet muted my footsteps, and each door I passed was shut tight. My room was at the far end of the corridor. I noticed a single light fixture flickering near the emergency stairwell. I also noticed a faint odor, like old wood or a damp basement. I tried to ignore it, but it stayed in my nose. I went into my room and dropped my stuff. I was still wearing my work clothes, so I loosened my tie and took off my jacket. The sun was going down and the room started to dim. I turned on the lamp by the bed. Then I remembered I needed a spare set of toiletries, so I headed back out to see if the front desk had any. The hallway looked emptier than before. I walked, hearing the slight squeak of the carpet under my shoes. Nothing else made a sound. When I got to the lobby, I asked the receptionist about some toiletries. He handed me a small travel-size kit. I thanked him and turned toward the elevator. That was when I heard him say something about dinner options. There was a small kitchen area they opened for guests around 7 p.m. I said I'd check it out, then stepped into the elevator. It took me back up to the third floor with a slight jerk. The doors opened and I stepped out. The hallway was dark. The light fixture that had been flickering was now completely off. I felt this strange pressure in the air, like the hallway was too tight. As I walked toward my room, I noticed something near the far end of the corridor. It was a silhouette of a person. It wasn't moving. It stood in front of the wall, where a framed painting hung. I saw the faint outline of a man or a tall figure, but there were no details. The shape was just there, leaning forward slightly as if studying the painting. My first thought was that it was another guest, maybe curious about the artwork. I kept moving forward, not sure if I should greet the person or just walk by. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The hallway lights were dim, but I could see enough to notice that the figure wasn't turning around. It stayed very still, like it didn't even sense me. When I was about 15 feet away, I spoke up. I said, "Excuse me?" Nothing. I paused, took a couple more steps. My heart started pounding. The figure shifted. It moved sideways, toward the corner of the corridor. I got a glimpse of what looked like a shoulder or an arm turning, but then it just vanished around the corner. I didn't hear any footsteps. I didn't see any door open. It was just gone. My skin started tingling. I felt sweat on my forehead. I walked toward the spot where the figure had been standing. There was a generic landscape painting on the wall, some mountain scene. I looked at the corner where the figure disappeared, but it was just a dead end leading to the fire escape door. The door had an alarm bar. If someone had opened it, the alarm would have sounded. There was no sound, no sign of anyone. I felt this sharp chill. I turned around and hurried back to my room. I locked the door behind me. My heart was still hammering in my chest. Inside my room, I leaned against the door for a moment. My thoughts raced. I tried to tell myself it was just another guest, maybe someone who didn't want to talk. But who stands in the hallway staring at a random painting at that time of day? And how did they vanish so silently? My mind kept going in circles. I sat on the bed and turned on the TV to break the silence. The channels were fuzzy, but I found some local news. I tried to calm down. Then I realized it was already 6 p.m. That was around the time I noticed the heavy air in the corridors. I started feeling it again, even inside my room. The air felt thick. My breathing was shallow. My stomach felt tight. I told myself I wouldn't go back out until morning. I wasn't in the mood to explore. I figured I'd order some food from whatever limited room service they had. But then I remembered the receptionist saying they only had a small kitchen area open for guests. I didn't recall any mention of real room service. I paced around the room, deciding if I should just starve until breakfast. My stomach growled. After some hesitation, I called the front desk. The same receptionist answered. I asked if there was room service. He said no, but I could come down to the little dining area if I wanted. They had some sandwiches and soup. I thanked him and hung up. It was about 7:15 p.m. by then. I was hungry, but I kept thinking about that figure in the hallway. My mind wouldn't let it go. Finally, my hunger pushed me to leave. I put on a casual shirt, grabbed my key, and opened the door. The corridor was dark. The overhead lights seemed weaker. My heart sped up again. I forced myself to walk. Each step felt tense, but I kept going. I glanced around constantly, expecting to see that silhouette again. The hallway was empty. I reached the elevator and pressed the button. The doors opened. I stepped inside, alone. The ride down felt slower than before. I was tapping my foot, trying to distract myself. When I arrived at the lobby, I saw a small sign pointing to the dining area. The receptionist was gone, replaced by a woman in a housekeeping uniform standing behind the front desk. She nodded at me but didn't smile. I walked into a simple dining room with 3 or 4 tables. A single overhead light kept the space well lit. There was a small counter with a few plastic-wrapped sandwiches, a thermal container labeled soup, and some packets of crackers. It wasn't much, but I wasn't in the mood to be picky. I grabbed a sandwich and poured some soup into a styrofoam cup. There was a microwave on the counter. I heated up the soup, then sat down to eat. The soup was lukewarm even after the microwave. The sandwich tasted bland. I kept checking the corridor leading to the lobby, waiting to see someone else. Nobody came. After a few minutes, the front desk phone rang. I heard the woman pick it up. She spoke in a low voice, but I didn't pay attention to her words. I finished my sandwich, tossed the wrapper in the trash, and decided to head back up. I wanted to get some sleep and leave early in the morning. On my way to the elevator, I felt a slight draft. It made me shiver. The woman at the front desk was busy flipping through some papers. She didn't look at me. I hit the elevator button again. Waited. The old doors opened with that same jerk. I stepped in. My stomach felt uneasy. I didn't want to see anything in that corridor again. But I had no choice. The elevator stopped on the third floor and the doors slid open with a dull chime. The hallway was dim, but the overhead lights were still on. My eyes swept left and right. No silhouette this time. I walked toward my room, forcing myself not to look at that painting. My footsteps felt extra loud. The building felt silent, like a vacuum. I made it to my door. I got inside fast and locked up. Then I let out a long breath. My nerves were on edge. The TV was still on from before, showing some late local broadcast. I kept it on for background noise. I sat at the edge of the bed and thought about what I had seen. I didn't have any explanation. It wasn't normal. It didn't look like a trick of the light. The figure moved on its own, and it vanished in a way I couldn't explain. I felt a chill on my arms, like the hairs were standing up. That night, I slept in short bursts. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined a dark shape standing in the corner of my room. I'd jerk awake, sweating and breathing hard. I turned on the bedside lamp at one point, just so I wouldn't be in total darkness. At around 3 a.m., I actually got up and checked the hallway through the peephole. I saw nothing. The hallway light was still on, flickering a bit, but no sign of anyone or anything. Eventually, I dozed off out of sheer exhaustion. Morning came. I got dressed fast, packed up my suitcase, and decided I wouldn't stay another day. I went downstairs, checked out with the same receptionist from the day before. He asked if everything was all right, and I said, "Yeah, just have to get back to work." I didn't mention the figure, I just wanted to leave. The roads were clear and the sun was shining. I got onto the mountain road and headed home. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, but I tried to shake it off. A few months later, my job required me to go to that same area again. I considered staying at a different place even if it was more expensive or farther from my meeting, but I figured maybe it was just a weird one-time thing. I ended up booking the same hotel for convenience. That was my mistake. I arrived in the afternoon. The sky was a bit overcast. The parking lot was mostly empty. I saw only 2 other cars. The receptionist gave me the key to room 310 this time, also on the 3rd floor. I carried my bag up the elevator. The hallway looked the same. The lights were dim. The carpet felt spongy. I heard a faint buzzing sound, maybe from an electrical panel. My stomach tightened. I tried to ignore it. The first day passed quietly. I had my meeting, grabbed a quick dinner in town, and got back to the hotel around 5:30 p.m. I walked through the lobby, saw a couple of workers standing around, then took the elevator up. The corridor felt heavy again. There was an odd hush. As I walked to my room, I noticed the time on my phone. 5:57 p.m. I felt a wave of goosebumps on my arms and neck. My stomach churned, and I suddenly remembered the last time. I reached my door, fumbled with the key, and hurried inside. I locked the door right away. My heart was beating fast. I looked at the clock on the bedside table. It said 5:59 p.m. I stood there, breathing quickly, waiting. The digital display changed to 6 p.m. My entire body tensed. I felt cold from head to toe. I couldn't hear anything outside, but my mind raced. I wondered if that figure was out there drifting around. At 6:05 p.m., I realized I was standing in the middle of the room, gripping my phone. I tried to calm down. I told myself to breathe. My hands were shaking. I turned on the TV for some noise. I tried to keep my eyes off the door. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I stayed like that for almost an hour, fully dressed, shoes on, not sure what to do. Finally, I ordered some takeout from a local place and asked them to bring it to the lobby. Around 7:30 p.m., I forced myself to go downstairs. I refused to stay in my room hungry all night. The hallway was empty. The elevator ride felt too slow. I picked up my food in the lobby from a delivery guy. Ate it right there in the lobby chairs. I didn't want to return to the 3rd floor yet. After I finished, I threw away the trash and checked the time again, 8:15 p.m. I sighed and took the elevator back up. The hallway was dim, the same flickering light near the corner. My room was about halfway down. I stepped out of the elevator. I took a few steps, then stopped. I heard something like a rustling sound. I stood still, listening. My heart thumped. The sound stopped. I didn't see anything. I forced myself to walk toward my room. The corridor smelled stale again. I felt that pressure in my head, like I wasn't getting enough oxygen. I reached the door, slid the key card, and stepped in. I turned around to shut the door. Before I closed it, I glanced back into the hallway. That was when I saw a faint movement near the far end. A dark shape moved behind the corner. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the key card. I shut the door and latched it. My skin felt clammy. The hair on my arms stood up again. I barely slept that night. My body kept jolting awake. Every small noise made me jump. Every time the old pipes clanged, I thought I'd see something in the room. I didn't, but the tension stayed with me. The next morning, I threw my clothes in the suitcase and checked out first thing. No one else was at the front desk except a half-asleep night clerk. I handed in my key without a word and left. After that, I never went back. I made excuses to my boss about staying elsewhere. I don't know who or what I saw in those hallways, but it wasn't a normal guest. It didn't act like one. It disappeared too easily. The staff never gave me a clear answer. Maybe they didn't know. All I know is that every time I think about that place, I feel that same heavy air in my chest. My arms get cold, and I remember that silent shape turning and vanishing into the corner. I haven't stayed in isolated mountain hotels since, and I always keep an eye on the time. Whenever it's close to 6 p.m., I feel a slight shiver and wonder if somewhere in those halls, that figure is still standing there, staring at that painting. I never expected to feel so uneasy in my own workplace. I've always been a practical guy. I handle deliveries, chop vegetables, cook a few dishes, and make sure everything's clean before I leave. This place was my comfort zone for years. Then, one night, something felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I work at a small neighborhood restaurant that only opens for lunch. We're usually done by 3 in the afternoon, and most of the staff heads out right after we serve our last meal. But I like to stay behind sometimes. I take my time washing the dishes, wiping down the counters, and organizing the stockroom. It helps me start the next day on the right foot. Plus, the quiet environment lets me do everything without distractions. I usually don't mind being in the restaurant alone, but that changed when strange things started happening. My name's Marco, and I've been in this line of work for over a decade. I've seen my share of clumsy servers dropping plates. I've seen rushes where we had lines out the door. I've seen days so slow that I ended up double-checking every shelf in the back. None of that ever made me feel uneasy. But these recent experiences left me with a cold knot in my stomach. It started about a month ago. I stayed late to clean the kitchen after a busy day. Everyone else had gone home. The only sound in the building came from the dishwasher spraying hot water. I had my forearms elbow deep in soapy water when I heard the distinct clang of silverware in the prep area. It sounded like a spoon or fork clattering against a metal surface. My first reaction was annoyance because I thought maybe I'd missed a piece of cutlery on a counter. But when I walked over to see, I found nothing out of place. Every piece of silverware was where I had left it. The counters were clear, and the sinks were empty except for the pile I was currently working on. I remember standing there looking around and feeling a slight chill. There was no one in the dining area. The doors were locked. The lights were still on, and nothing seemed moved or touched. I shrugged it off and returned to the sink. A few minutes later, I heard the same kind of noise. Something metallic dropping onto a counter. This time I reacted fast. I turned off the water, dried my hands on a towel, and ran to the prep area. Again, there was nothing. Nothing on the floor, no utensils out of place. I checked under the prep tables, behind the equipment, and even inside the trash can. No sign of anything that could have made that noise. My heartbeat was a little faster, but I told myself it was my imagination. That went on for a couple of weeks. Every so often when I was alone, I'd hear the distinct sound of a fork hitting a metal counter. Sometimes it was a spatula or a spoon. Every single time there was nothing to see. It was like someone was messing with me. I started to wonder if I was simply tired or if there was some mechanical explanation. Maybe the air conditioner was causing vibrations. Maybe I had set something on the edge of a counter and it fell. But every time I checked, everything was steady and neatly in place. I kept working as usual, trying to ignore the strange sounds. I didn't want to mention it to my coworkers because I wasn't in the mood for jokes or ghost stories. I also didn't want the owner to think I was losing my mind. So I dealt with it quietly. I took extra care to place everything properly, double-checking that utensils weren't near the edges of any surfaces. I even unplugged the AC once to see if it changed anything. The noises still came, always out of nowhere and always when I was busy washing something or had my back turned. Then one evening, it escalated. I had stayed late again. I was wiping down the counters near the sink. Our freezer, a big walk-in unit, is on the opposite side of the kitchen from the dishwasher. I had locked it earlier because we keep some expensive meats inside, and the rule is to lock it after lunch service. We don't open it again until the next day. I'm pretty strict about that because I'm responsible if something goes missing. That night, as I finished cleaning a counter, I happened to turn around. I noticed the freezer door was slightly open, not wide open, but enough that I could see the strip of rubber seal. My first thought was that I'd forgotten to lock it, but I remembered locking it. I distinctly recalled hearing the click of the lock. I walked over, checked the lock, and sure enough, it was in the unlocked position. That made no sense because I'd locked it a couple hours earlier. I didn't see any sign of damage or tampering. Nothing was missing inside. I shut the door again, turned the lock, and pulled on the handle to make sure it was secured. Then I headed back to the sink, trying to focus on the last round of dishes. I felt a bit uneasy, but I told myself I might have been distracted and not locked it properly the first time. I started scrubbing some big pots. Within minutes, I heard a sharp clang. It wasn't the clatter of silverware this time. It sounded like a spatula hitting the metal prep counter. I felt my back tense up. The hair on my arm stood on end. I didn't hesitate. I put the pot down and walked straight to the prep area. Sure enough, I saw a spatula lying on the counter. It hadn't been there a few minutes earlier. I always keep utensils in a small plastic bin after washing them, so seeing it on the counter felt wrong. My skin was crawling, but I forced myself to pick it up, check if it was wet, or if I'd just left it there by mistake. It was dry. I had washed all the utensils earlier in the day, and I hadn't used a spatula in hours. Then I noticed the freezer door again. It was open just as it had been before. The lock was unlatched. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no one else in the kitchen. The front doors were locked. The back door was bolted. All the windows were shut. My mind started racing with questions. How could a locked freezer door open on its own? Why did the lock keep switching to the open position? My hands felt clammy. I took a couple of steps toward the freezer door, unsure if I even wanted to touch it. Then I heard a faint sound from inside the freezer, like shifting boxes. I froze in place. My breathing grew shallow. My chest felt tight. I wanted to believe it was just the refrigeration unit making noise, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded like something or someone was moving things around. I gripped the spatula in my hand, though I'm not sure why I did that. Maybe it was comforting to hold something. After a few moments, the noise stopped. I stood there listening for a while, trying to decide if I should open the freezer and look inside. But then a thought crossed my mind. I locked this door twice and it opened both times. That shouldn't be possible. If there's someone in there, how did they get in? And if no one's in there, then why does it keep unlocking itself? I stepped closer, reached out, and pushed the freezer door open. The inside light revealed metal shelves with boxes of frozen meat, bags of vegetables, and some plastic containers. I didn't see any movement, though the shelves blocked parts of the freezer from my line of sight. I stepped inside carefully, feeling the cold air hit my face. My heart was pounding so hard I felt the pulse in my neck. I scanned left and right. Everything looked normal except one cardboard box on the top shelf was slightly pulled forward, as if someone had tried to grab it. I slowly pushed the box back into place and turned around to leave. Right as I reached the door, I heard a tap behind me like plastic hitting metal. I spun around, but I didn't see anything. I didn't want to stay in that cold space anymore. I walked out fast, shutting the door and locked it for the third time that night. Then I backed away from it, keeping my eyes on the handle. I felt a combination of fear and anger. I was scared because I couldn't explain any of this, and it made me feel like I had no control. I was angry because I didn't like feeling afraid in my own workplace, a place I used to see as safe and predictable. The spatula was still in my hand. I placed it in the utensil bin and took a deep breath. I told myself to finish cleaning. I tried to refocus on the dishes, but I couldn't keep my mind off that door. Every small noise made me jump. The hum of the refrigerator sounded louder than usual. The fluorescent lights in the kitchen flickered slightly. My palms were sweaty. I tried to calm down, but my nerves were shot. After a few more minutes of half-hearted scrubbing, I heard another clang. This time, it sounded like it came from the dry storage area in the back. I froze again, my hand still holding a damp rag. I couldn't bring myself to investigate anymore. I didn't want to walk through the kitchen alone. I felt like whatever was happening would keep escalating. I made a decision right then. I turned off the sink, tossed the rag aside, and headed for the back door. I removed my apron, grabbed my keys and phone, and walked out without looking back. Usually, I would check the ovens, the stove, and the lights. I'd double-check the doors and set the alarm system. But none of that felt important at that moment. I just wanted to leave. My chest was tight, and I felt a dull ache in my stomach. My instincts told me to get out. I locked the back door as best as I could, hopped in my car, and drove off. On the ride home, my mind raced with possibilities. Could someone have broken in and hidden somewhere in the restaurant? That didn't make sense because I'd locked everything, and I never saw a single sign of forced entry. Could it have been a prank by a coworker with a spare key? That also seemed unlikely because everyone knows I don't scare easily, and they usually respect my time after hours. Plus, I'd stayed late dozens of times without any issues. Why now? When I got home, I tossed my keys on the kitchen counter and gulped a glass of water. My hands were shaking. I couldn't stop thinking about the freezer door unlocking on its own, the spatula hitting the counter, and the weird sounds from inside the freezer. I didn't feel relief. I felt like I'd abandoned my post or left a job incomplete. But at the same time, staying there longer didn't seem like an option. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that freezer door cracking open again. I kept hearing the clang of metal in my head. My heart would race, and I'd sit up in bed, breathing heavily. I checked the time all night, waiting for morning to come so I could talk to someone about it. But then I worried about sounding crazy if I told the owner what had happened. The next morning I went in early, acting like nothing was wrong. The place was quiet, and I checked the freezer door first thing. It was locked just like I'd left it. Nothing looked stolen or moved. I flipped the lights on and did my normal routine. Some coworkers arrived, and we started prepping for lunch service. Nobody mentioned seeing anything odd. I asked one of the guys if he had noticed the freezer door unlocked recently. He said no, then gave me a questioning look. I brushed it off and changed the subject. All day I couldn't shake the tension in my shoulders. My neck felt stiff. I kept glancing at the freezer door. It stayed closed and locked, like it was mocking me. Lunch service went by in a blur. Customers left, and eventually the place was empty again. By 3 in the afternoon, it was time to close. The owner handed me the keys and said, "I'm heading out. Can you finish up?" I nodded, but inside I felt a pit in my stomach. I was dreading another round of cleaning alone. I almost made up an excuse to leave early, but I didn't want to seem scared. When everyone was gone, I stood there in the kitchen with the lights on, the dishwasher humming. I wiped my forehead. I told myself I'd do a quick clean and get out. No extra tasks, no lingering. I started with the tables in the dining area, then moved to the kitchen counters. Everything felt normal for the first few minutes. No strange sounds, no open doors. But I couldn't relax. Every clang of a pot or rush of water made me jump. I kept glancing at the freezer door. It stayed shut. I finished the basics and looked at the time. I decided enough was enough. I was about to shut off the lights and leave when I heard a metallic scrape near the prep table. My stomach tightened. I refused to check. I walked straight to the back door, turned the lock, and stepped outside. I locked it behind me, heart racing, breathing fast. I didn't even check the front door. I hoped everything was locked, but I wasn't going to go back in to make sure. Now I'm home again, recounting every detail in my head. My heart still pounds when I think about those nights. I feel shaky when I recall how that freezer door was open more than once, even though I locked it. I can't explain it. I don't have a neat conclusion or a theory that makes sense. I just know that being in that restaurant alone doesn't feel safe anymore. I don't know if there's someone hiding or if there's some electrical glitch causing all this. I only know that I felt a presence. I felt watched. I'm torn because I've worked at this place for years, and I need the income. At the same time, I'm not sure if I can handle more nights like that. I already told the owner I might need to leave earlier. He didn't argue too much. Maybe he picked up on my stress, or maybe he's noticed strange things too. I haven't asked him directly. I'm still not ready to talk about it in detail. Right now, I'm just trying to keep it together and not let this fear control me. But every time I recall the sound of that spatula hitting the metal counter, I feel a shiver. My arms get goosebumps. I can't forget that look of the freezer door cracked open when I knew it was locked. I can't forget the tapping sound I heard from inside the freezer. I've never been one to believe in unexplained events, but now I'm stuck. I only know I walked out that night because I was sure there was something in there with me and I couldn't see it. That's enough for me to stay on guard from now on. I might bring a friend next time or insist on having someone stay with me if I clean up. I can't handle that feeling again. It was too real, too unsettling, and it's changed the way I see that quiet little restaurant after closing. I'm not looking for answers right now. I just don't want to be alone in there again. If I hear that silverware dropping or see that freezer door unlocked one more time, I might just walk out for good. And I never thought I'd say that about a place I used to consider my second home. I should have known something was off the first time I stepped out of the elevator and smelled that strange cologne. It wasn't subtle. It was strong and right in my face, like someone had just sprayed it and walked away. No one was there, though. I looked around the corridor on the 4th floor, saw empty offices, dusty floors, and a single flickering light near the stairwell. I shrugged and chalked it up to some old pipe or weird chemical in the walls. But deep down, something about it felt wrong from day one. When my company decided to move to this old building in the downtown area, I didn't question it much. Real estate was cheap, the location was central, and everyone wanted to cut costs. I ended up in a cramped room on the 4th floor because they asked me to manage a pile of documents that wouldn't fit in the main office. I was told I'd have lots of peace and quiet to get things organized. The day we moved in, I noticed half the floors seemed empty. The place had an odd vibe. The paint was peeling in some corners, the ceilings were high, and there was a musty smell in the stairwells. A few security guards walked around, but they seemed bored. I didn't think much of it, I just wanted to get my job done. My first week, I established a routine. I got there a little before 9 a.m., hauled boxes of files up in the elevator, and spread them out on the big wooden table in my office. The windows overlooked a narrow side street. The view was mostly other buildings, some with smashed windows, some with old brick walls. I sorted and labeled documents. By lunch, I'd grab something from a food truck nearby, come back, and work until about 5 p.m. The first couple of days went fine. There was a lot of dust, but no real problems. Then, on Wednesday, around 4 p.m., when I smelled that cologne again, It was so sudden that I actually turned around in my chair, expecting to see someone right behind me. I didn't see a soul. I sniffed the air, trying to pinpoint the source. I wondered if maybe there was a hidden air freshener or a vent, but I couldn't locate anything. It was just a strong, masculine scent, hanging in the air for maybe 30 seconds before fading. I told myself it was a weird building quirk. I got back to my papers, but I felt uneasy. My hands were a little shaky, though I wasn't sure why. I figured I was just tired. That night I told a coworker about it in a casual way. She laughed and said old buildings always have weird smells. I agreed, but it stuck with me. The next day I was alone again. The same thing happened at the exact same time, 4 p.m. I checked the hallway, half expecting to find someone. No one was there. I poked my head into the other offices on that floor. They were all empty. Most of them didn't even have furniture. The overhead lights were off. I walked over to the stairwell. I saw a security guard on the first floor when I looked down the center. He glanced up at me, waved, and I waved back. Nothing seemed unusual, so I returned to my office and tried to ignore the lingering smell. By Friday, I was starting to feel anxious around 3:55 p.m. I couldn't focus on my work because I was waiting for the smell to appear. I checked my watch over and over. Sure enough, around 4 p.m., the cologne came again, just as strong. I got up immediately and looked out in the hallway. Nothing. I moved fast toward the elevator and pressed the button to go down to the lobby. When I reached the security desk, I asked the guard if any other employees were stationed on the 4th floor. He shook his head. He said nobody else had a key to any offices up there. I asked if there was any vent or system that might blow perfume around at certain times. He said that didn't make sense. The ventilation system was old and didn't have anything like that. Over the weekend, I tried to forget it. I relaxed at home, watched some TV, did my chores. But on Sunday night, I started feeling uneasy about going back. I told myself I was being silly. It's just a smell. It's not like something was attacking me. But that kind of unexplained thing can eat at you. Monday, I forced myself to go in and act normal. I arrived a bit earlier than usual, found my office untouched, and started working. I looked at the clock around 2:30 p.m. and felt my stomach clench. I tried to concentrate on scanning documents and labeling folders. Then 4 p.m. came. The cologne hit me again, as strong as ever. It was like standing in a small bathroom right after someone sprayed themselves. I stood up and walked out to the hallway. Nothing. I listened. I heard my own breath and maybe a soft hum from the fluorescent lights. I couldn't detect any footsteps or doors closing. I decided to open the window, which was something I usually avoided because the frame was old and stiff. The afternoon sun was streaming in and the air outside was stale. That day I wanted to clear out the cologne smell. I lifted the window open and felt the breeze pass through. Then I noticed something weird on the glass. There was a faint outline of a hand. It looked like someone with a bigger hand than mine had pressed their palm against the window. It didn't look fresh, but it wasn't there before, or at least I hadn't noticed it. I took a cloth and some cleaning spray from a cabinet and wiped it off. The glass got clean and I felt a bit better. I closed the window and went back to my desk. About 15 minutes later, I got up to grab some water. I glanced at the window again. The same exact handprint was back in the same position, as though I had never wiped it. My neck tingled and my stomach felt hollow. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I'd imagined wiping it. But I remembered the exact motion of scrubbing the glass. My heart pounded in my chest. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I marched up to the window with the same cloth. I pressed it against the glass again and wiped thoroughly. I could see the streaks as I wiped, so I knew I was removing it. When I stepped back, the print was gone. This time I stayed there watching the glass. I started counting the seconds. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Around 5 minutes passed and nothing happened. I sighed, stepped away, and turned back to my desk. I tried to calm my nerves. Then I turned back to the window and the handprint was there again, as clear as before. I felt my throat tighten. I wiped sweat from my forehead with my sleeve. My hand shook. I didn't know what to do. I pressed the panic button on my phone, searching the building directory for someone I could call. My boss wouldn't care about a weird handprint. The security guys would probably think I was playing a prank. I decided to handle it myself. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the room. I closed the door, not bothering to lock it. I ran down the hallway to the elevator. All I could think was, I need to get out of here. I practically hammered the elevator button until it opened. I stepped in and tapped the lobby button. When I got to the ground floor, I sped past the security desk without saying anything. I think one of the guards called out to me, but I ignored him and went straight to my car. That evening, I felt jittery and couldn't sleep well. My mind kept replaying the moment I saw that handprint reappear. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the glass was smudged from the inside and something about the light made it look like a handprint. But I had wiped it clean twice, and I saw the difference each time. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, feeling a sense of dread. But I had a job to do and I couldn't just refuse to go in. When I got there, everything seemed normal at first. The building was quiet. The hallway to my office looked the same, except for a few more footprints in the dust that I guessed were from my shoes. I walked into my office, placed my bag on the table, and glanced at the window. There was no sign of any handprint. I didn't feel any strange scents. I sat down and got to work, trying to distract myself. By 2 p.m., I was feeling on edge again. Every few seconds, I'd check the window. I also caught myself sniffing the air. It was like I was anticipating that cologne. By 3:30 p.m., my palms were sweating. I tapped my pen on the table and stared at the clock on my phone. My heart kept thudding in my chest. At 4 p.m. exactly, the smell flooded the room. It was overwhelming, like being trapped in a small elevator with someone who doused themselves in cheap aftershave. The smell was so strong my eyes watered. I stood up, grabbed the window handle and flung it open, hoping the outside air would push the smell out. The breeze from the street did almost nothing to dissipate it. Then I saw the handprint again, on the outside of the glass, like it was pressed from the street side. I leaned out, trying to see if there was a ledge or a fire escape. There was nothing, just a drop down to the alley. No place for anyone to stand or press their hand. My stomach churned. My legs felt weak. That was the moment I realized I might be dealing with something that doesn't make sense in a normal way. I felt lightheaded. My breathing got shallow. I heard my pulse pounding in my ears. I made a quick decision to grab my phone and record a video. I wanted to document it. I started filming the window, talking in a shaky voice, explaining what I saw. Then I wiped the glass again while recording. I showed the clean window on camera. After about 2 minutes, the handprint faded in like it was forming from the outside. My phone started shaking in my hand because I was trembling so hard. I muttered a few curses. I felt my mouth go dry. I stopped recording and locked my phone. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I raced out into the hallway, my footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. I found a security guard in the lobby. He asked if I was okay. I told him I needed him to come upstairs. He followed me with a concerned look. In the elevator, he kept asking what was going on. I just told him something was wrong in my office. When we got there, the smell had vanished. We walked to the window. The handprint was gone too. The guard gave me a puzzled look. I tried to show him the video on my phone, but I noticed it was corrupted. It wouldn't play. I tried tapping the file, but it gave me an error. I stared at the screen, speechless. The guard looked at me like I was crazy. I didn't know what to say. He patted my shoulder and said maybe I should take a break. For the rest of that day, I sat in the break room on the first floor, drinking coffee. Every time I thought about going back to the 4th floor, my chest felt tight. That night, I told my boss I wanted to move the documents to another area. He said it wasn't possible. We had no budget for more space. The next day, I forced myself upstairs again around 9 p.m. Everything stayed quiet until 4 p.m. The smell appeared right on schedule, but I was already in the hallway heading for the elevator. I caught a whiff of the cologne and half ran to the elevator, jamming the button. I refused to look back at my office. Now I've started arranging my schedule so I'm not in that office after 3:30 p.m. If I need to stay later, I do my work in the break room, or I hang around in someone else's space on a lower floor. I told the security guards about the smell again, but they just shrugged. I think they believe me on some level, but there's nothing they can do. They've walked through that floor at different times, but they haven't encountered anything unusual. One of them joked it might be a ghost who loves cologne. I didn't laugh. I haven't seen the handprint again because I don't stick around long enough to check. The building is big, and there are plenty of places to work, so I've been carrying documents down to the second floor. My boss asked why I was dragging boxes back and forth. I told him I needed more elbow room. He grumbled, but didn't push too hard. I keep telling myself it's all in my head, that maybe I'm stressed, but I can't ignore what I saw. A few times I've tried to show up very early in the morning, thinking maybe I can work longer without dealing with that 4 p.m. moment. But I'm always watching the clock, and the tension starts building in my chest as the hour approaches. It's worse than just running away. It's like waiting for something to happen, and that anticipation makes my skin crawl. My coworkers notice I'm jumpy, but I don't want to explain everything. It sounds too ridiculous. I gave a vague story about a possible chemical leak or some weird old pipe situation. Truth is, I don't think any ordinary explanation works here. I've checked the windows, I've checked the walls, and I've checked the building layout. There's no reason for a handprint to appear on the outside of that glass, and there's no reason for that cologne to show up at exactly 4 p.m. Yet it does. Every single time I'm in that office at that hour. I don't know if it happens when I'm gone. Maybe it's just triggered by my presence. That thought makes my spine tingle. For now, I'm making sure I'm never alone in that office after lunch. I sometimes ask a coworker to help me with the documents, even though I don't really need help. I just don't want to be up there alone. At least if there's someone else around, I feel a bit safer. But I also feel guilty, because I'm roping them into a place that makes my skin crawl. I pretend everything's fine, but my voice shakes a bit, and I find excuses to leave early. If they notice something's off, they don't say it out loud. I'm not sure what my next step is. The building is ours, and I can't force management to leave. They got a good deal on the rent, apparently. People are comfortable on the lower floors. It's just the 4th floor that's empty and odd. The security guys won't do anything unless there's a real threat. And I'm not about to call the cops over a strange smell and a handprint that disappears. I'd be a laughingstock. All I know is I hate that place now. It gives me a knot in my stomach when I think about it. I keep seeing that handprint in my mind at night when I try to fall asleep. I can still smell that cologne. It's like it's burned into my nose. It's not a scent I recognize. It's not a brand I know. It just smells strong and old-fashioned. I've tested out different colognes at a store to see if any match. None do. The store clerk thought I was nuts, sniffing the air and shaking my head. I wish I had a simple explanation. Sometimes I think I'm just stressed, or maybe there's mold in the walls affecting my mind. But that doesn't explain how a guard came up and found nothing, or how the video got corrupted. I didn't do that on purpose. That afternoon was one of the scariest moments I've had in a while. My heart was hammering in my chest like I'd run a marathon. My clothes stuck to my back with sweat. Anyway, I've settled into a new routine now. I pack up my stuff around 3 p.m. and get out. I don't care if the documents are in order or if there's more work to do. I won't stay in that room when the clock hits 4. No one's pushing me to do otherwise. If they ever force me to stay, I might have to bring a coworker or maybe a security guard to sit with me. But for now, I'm keeping my distance. I don't know what else to do. I haven't told many people about it. The ones I have told just look skeptical. So I'm dealing with it in my own way. I don't mind being there in the morning. There's almost a peaceful calm to the place when the sunlight filters through the dusty windows. But as the day goes on, I start looking at the clock and feeling my heart pick up speed. I won't let myself be in that room at 4 anymore. I learned my lesson. And no matter what anyone says, I know something isn't right in that office. That handprint shouldn't come back after I wipe it. But it does. And that smell shouldn't appear out of nowhere. But it does. That's all I know. No one has died. No one has been attacked. But it freaks me out. I can't explain it. I've decided it's not worth risking my sanity. I do my job. Then I leave. If something changes, I'll deal with it then. But right now, if you asked me to stay up there alone around 4 p.m., I'd say no way. I can't pretend it's normal. I can't pretend it's safe. So I'm done trying to face it head on. Avoiding the problem might not be heroic, but it's the only strategy I have. And until my boss gives me another spot to work, that's the plan. I still remember the exact feeling in my gut when I realized something about that night didn't make sense. It was late, maybe a little past 11. The gym was quiet, and I'd already seen most of the regulars leave. The overhead lights were on, but I'd started switching off the ones in the stretching area. I was tired and ready to lock up. My shift always ended around that time, and I usually did a final walkthrough to make sure no one was still inside. I was standing at the front desk, flipping through some notes about membership renewals, when I spotted someone moving quickly across the floor toward the men's locker room. He looked like any other guy who might come in to grab something he forgot. His head was down and he carried a dark backpack over his right shoulder. I called out to ask if he needed anything, but he didn't respond. He just pushed the locker room door open and went inside. At first I thought maybe he had headphones on or was in a hurry. I felt a little annoyed because I wanted to go home, but I also had a routine to follow. We always had to make sure the place was empty. I figured I'd give him a few minutes. Sometimes people run in at the last minute to retrieve their keys or phone. I waited behind the front desk for a few moments, expecting him to walk out right away. But time started dragging. I glanced at the big wall clock near the entrance and saw that a good 5 minutes had passed. I thought, okay, maybe he's taking longer than usual. So I walked around the front desk and moved toward the locker room entrance. The motion sensor for the lights in that hallway clicked and the lights switched on, making everything bright. I stepped up to the men's locker room door and pushed it open. I leaned my head in and called, "Hey man, we're closing up soon." My voice echoed against the tile walls. No answer. The place was quiet. I stood there listening for any sound of movement. Lockers opening, the shower running, anything at all. It was dead silent. I stepped inside. The locker room had a row of lockers on each side, plus a separate shower area in the back. The smell of cleaning product and old gym socks was strong, like it always was this late at night. I walked all the way to the far end, checking each aisle of lockers. I called out again. "Hello? We're closing. You good in here?" Still no response. I even checked the shower area, flipping the light switch on the wall, but everything was empty. The floors were dry. There was no sign of anyone. I felt a small jolt of confusion in my chest. My arms started to feel a little tense, and I noticed my palms were slightly sweaty. I thought maybe the guy had left quickly, but I knew I would have seen him, or at least heard the door. I glanced at the restroom stalls. All of them were open and empty. There was nowhere else he could have gone. I walked back out to the main gym floor. My footsteps sounded too loud on the tile. The big open space was silent. My mind raced with possible explanations. Maybe I missed him somehow. Maybe he walked out while I was behind the desk. But that seemed impossible because from my position near the hallway, I would have seen him. I decided to check the front door log. We have an electronic reader that tracks entries and exits with membership cards. If someone scans in, it registers. I scrolled through the log for that time period. Nothing. No entry. No exit. It didn't even show that anybody else was in the building except me. That made me uneasy. I felt a slight pressure in my chest, like my heart was beating a bit harder. My mouth went dry. I moved to the security monitor. We had a set of cameras covering the front desk, the main workout area, and the hallway leading to the locker rooms. I rewound the footage for the last 10 minutes. On screen, I saw myself behind the desk, flipping through notes. I saw the empty gym floor. Then, at the moment I thought I saw the man, there was nothing. No movement, no person, no shape. It was just me looking up and staring at nothing. I saw myself step out from behind the desk and walk toward the locker room door. The door opened on the monitor, and I disappeared inside. But there was no one else on the screen. I felt a wave of goosebumps on my arms and the back of my neck. My breathing got heavier. I stared at the footage again. I even paused it and rewound it to check frame by frame. There was no sign of a man with a backpack. I rubbed my eyes and leaned back in the chair, trying to stay calm. I told myself that I must have imagined it. Maybe I was tired and saw a shadow or something. But my mind kept going back to that clear image of the man. He had a dark backpack on his right shoulder, and I remember the door swinging open. I got up from the security station and walked back to the locker room again. I pushed the door open with more force this time, letting it slam against the inside wall. I called out, "Is anyone in here?" My voice sounded shaky to me. It echoed again, and I waited, listening to the buzz of the overhead light. I made sure to check every row of lockers a second time. I opened a few lockers randomly, thinking maybe someone was messing with me. They were empty, except for the usual stray socks and water bottles. The air felt colder than usual, and I noticed the hair on my arm standing up. My stomach felt tight. I remember swallowing hard because my throat felt dry. I even bent down to see if there were any shoes peeking out under the benches or inside the shower area. Nothing. Everything was normal except for the fact that I was sure I'd seen someone come in. I left the locker room and went to double-check the front door. It was locked. I pulled on it a couple times. No movement. The only other exit is the emergency door on the other side of the gym, near the weight area. That door has an alarm that goes off if someone opens it. I would have heard it if that guy had tried to leave that way. It was silent all night. I went to the back door near the storage room. That door also has a security alarm that beeps if someone pushes it from the inside. I checked the panel, and it showed no triggers. That means no one left through there. My heart started pounding. I felt lightheaded. The place suddenly seemed bigger and emptier than before. Every sound, like the hum of the air conditioning, felt louder. I realized how alone I was. Normally, that doesn't bother me. I've worked plenty of late shifts by myself, but in that moment I felt uneasy. I turned off the main lights in the gym, leaving only the smaller hallway lights and the front desk lamp on. Usually, that's what I do right before locking up, but I rushed through it this time. I felt like I wanted to leave. Still, I worried that maybe I was missing something. If someone was in there, I couldn't just lock them in. But the cameras showed no trace of anyone, and the building was silent. I returned to the men's locker room once more just to be absolutely sure. The overhead fan was still running, and the fluorescent lights flickered a bit. The lockers looked the same as before. I didn't see any sign of wet footprints or a dropped towel. I started opening each locker door one by one, letting the metal clang echo around me. My hands were shaking a little. I felt the tension in my shoulders. My lower back felt stiff. After looking inside every locker in that section, I still found nothing. Then I walked to the back corner and stood near the entrance to the shower area. There was a small mirror there, and I caught a glimpse of myself. My face looked pale and my eyes were wide. I was breathing through my mouth. I took a few slow breaths to calm down. The door to the shower area was open, and the lights were on. I stepped inside. 5 shower stalls in a row. All empty. All dry. I could hear the faint drip of a faucet, so I checked that stall. The faucet was tight, and a single droplet of water hit the drain once every few seconds. I stood there for a moment, forcing myself to stay put. I didn't want to run out like a coward, but my gut kept telling me something was off. I thought about how that man had walked so casually into the locker room. I could almost replay the scene in my head. His posture, the way he moved, the color of his backpack. It was too clear to be a random illusion. The longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I felt. Eventually, I walked out, letting the door swing behind me. I decided I'd done enough. If the cameras showed nothing, and if he wasn't physically there, then I didn't have any way to explain it. I checked the women's locker room as well, just to be extra sure I wasn't confusing the 2 entrances. It was empty, too. At that point, I realized it was already a little past midnight. My shift should have ended earlier, but I got stuck trying to make sense of this weird situation. I locked up the gym, turning off the last of the lights. Before leaving, I ran the footage one more time, scanning for any evidence of the man. Still nothing. It showed me staring at something invisible. It was unnerving. I stepped outside into the parking lot. It was quiet and dim, with only a few streetlights overhead. My car was the only one left in the lot. I felt that same chill I had inside. I kept looking around, expecting to see that man standing somewhere in the shadows, but there was no one. I got in my car, locked the door, and sat for a second, trying to calm down. The silence was heavy. I could almost hear my own heartbeat in my ears. On the drive home, I kept replaying everything in my mind. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a reflection on the glass that made me believe I saw someone. But I remember hearing the locker room door squeak open, which usually only happens when someone pushes it. My instincts told me I wasn't just seeing things. I got home, parked, and sat in my living room for a while without turning on the lights. I felt on edge. My arms were jittery and my legs wouldn't stop bouncing. I kept looking at my phone, wondering if I should call someone and talk about it, but I felt embarrassed. It sounded too crazy to bring up. Who would believe that I saw someone in the gym who didn't appear on camera? Most of my friends would tease me or say I needed more sleep. The next day I mentioned it briefly to a coworker. He shrugged and said weird stuff happens at night sometimes. He'd never experienced something like that, but he said some of the cleaning crew reported strange noises in the locker rooms before. Nothing big, just bangs or clanking sounds they couldn't explain. We joked about the place being haunted, but I didn't feel like laughing. Over the next few nights, I tried to shake it off. I worked the same shift, closed up as usual, and tried not to think about that man. But each night, around the same time, I found myself scanning the floor expecting to see him again. The tension in my shoulders never fully went away, and I felt a little uneasy whenever I walked near the locker room. Sometimes I'd peek in there before starting the closing routine, just to make sure everything was normal. I never saw him again. I never found any more clues on the cameras or in the building. It became this strange memory I carried around, with no explanation. I still wonder if I was just exhausted and somehow hallucinated the whole thing. But I've never had a moment like that before or since. Even when I'm tired, I don't usually see people who aren't there. And the detail of the dark backpack still bugs me. I can't come up with a reason why I'd imagine that specific detail. It's been months since it happened, and I still don't have an answer. I've talked to a few people about it now, and the reactions vary. Some roll their eyes, others look a bit spooked. I don't blame them. It's not a story with a neat conclusion. I didn't follow a strange figure into a dark room and discover something horrific. I didn't hear any screams or witness anything violent. I just saw a guy walk into the locker room, then vanish without a trace. I have no proof that he ever existed that night. The cameras showed nothing, and the security log showed no entry. If it weren't for my own eyes, I'd say no one was there at all. But I know what I saw. I know I walked in behind him and felt the door close before I stepped inside. I heard the echo of his footsteps on the tile floor. That wasn't in my head. At least it didn't feel like it was. Since then, I haven't had any more unexplained encounters during my shift. But every time I think about that night, I get that same cold feeling in my chest. Part of me is relieved he never showed up again. Another part of me still checks the hallway whenever I'm closing, half expecting him to walk by with that same dark backpack. I don't know if I'll ever forget that moment. It felt like a line between reality and something else got crossed. These days, I just do my job and try not to dwell on it too much. But every now and then, especially when I'm alone in the locker room or staring at the security monitors, I get a flash of that scene in my mind. And I can't help but wonder what really happened and where that man went. It's a question that never leaves me completely. So I lock up each night, double-check the cameras, and hope I don't see that figure again. But there's always a part of me that stays on edge, waiting for that door to squeak open and for a man with a dark backpack to step inside, only to vanish once more.